Never underestimate a woman who knows exactly what she's worth. I remember my grandmother telling me that when I was just 16. It took me 15 more years to truly understand what she meant. By the time I did, I had transformed from Olivia Morgan, the trusting fiancée, to the woman who orchestrated one of the most satisfying revenges in the history of broken engagements. This is the story of how I turned the most humiliating moment of my life into the most empowering. Let me set the scene. Crystal champagne flutes catching the amber glow of string lights. The elegant terrace of the Harrington Hotel overlooking the Chicago skyline. A string quartet playing softly as waiters in crisp white jackets weaved through clusters of guests in designer evening wear. Our engagement party had been meticulously planned down to the last gardenia in the centerpieces. After all, the union of James Caldwell, heir to the Caldwell real estate fortune, and Olivia Morgan, rising star at Barrett Frost law firm, was the social event of the season, at least according to James's mother, who had spared no expense. Despite my protests, "You look stunning," whispered Cassandra, my best friend since law school, as we stood near the ornate chocolate fountain that James's mother had insisted upon. Like a bride from a magazine. I smoothed the silk of my ivory dress, custom designed by Eleanor Richards, another extravagance I'd reluctantly accepted. "I feel like I'm playing dress-up in someone else's life," I admitted. "Enjoy it," Cassandra laughed, gesturing with her champagne. "Most of us will never see this side of the velvet rope. If only I'd known how prophetic those words would be." I spotted James across the room, his tall frame easily visible as he chatted with his father's business associates. With his perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit and that characteristic dimpled smile, he looked every bit the golden heir apparent. 3 years together, and sometimes I still couldn't believe that James Caldwell had chosen me, a girl from Springfield, who had put herself through law school with scholarships and student loans. "There you are." His arm slid around my waist, pulling me close enough to smell his cologne, Clive Christian, another gift from his mother. "My father wants to make the toast in 15 minutes. I nodded, relaxing into his embrace. "Everything is perfect," I said, meant as reassurance but somehow coming out like a question. James's smile dimmed slightly. "About that, there's something we should discuss after the party." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "What is it?" "Nothing urgent," he said, his smile returning too quickly. "Just some paperwork, my father's. Lawyers prepared, a formality." He kissed my cheek. "Tonight is about celebrating." Before I could press him further, his father, Richard Caldwell, commanding even at 70, signaled to James from across the room. "Duty calls," James said, straightening his already impeccable tie. "Remember, 15 minutes for the toast." I watched him weave through the crowd, accepting congratulations with the practiced ease of someone born into privilege. The paperwork comment lingered uncomfortably, but I pushed it aside. We were lawyers, after all. Paperwork was part of our shared language. 14 minutes later, as Richard Caldwell tapped his crystal flute to command attention, the double doors to the terrace burst open with theatrical timing. The quartet stuttered to a stop. 200 guests turned in unison, and there she stood, Veronica Hayes, in a red dress that seemed painted onto her body, her expression a mixture of determination and fury. "Sorry I'm late," she announced to the stunned crowd. "Traffic was a nightmare." The silence that followed was deafening. James went pale beside his father, his champagne flute frozen halfway to his lips. Mrs. Caldwell clutched her pearl necklace, as if physically restraining herself from collapsing. I knew instantly who she was, not by name, but by type. The way James's eyes widened in panic, the way Mrs. Caldwell's face contorted with horror. The woman in red was the embodiment of every fiancé's worst nightmare. Veronica's eyes locked on mine across the terrace. "You must be Olivia," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "I'm Veronica, James's other significant. Commitment." The world tilted sideways. I felt Cassandra's hand grip my elbow, steadying me. "Security!" Richard Caldwell barked, recovering first. "Remove this woman immediately." Two men in dark suits moved toward Veronica, but she held up her phone. "Touch me, and I send these photos to every guest here. I have all your emails from the invitation list." She smiled thinly. James was thoughtful enough to forward it to me. The security guards hesitated, looking to Richard for direction. James finally unfroze, handing his champagne to his father and striding toward Veronica. "This isn't the place," he hissed, grabbing her arm. "No," she challenged loudly. "Then, where is the place, James? Your apartment on Lakeshore Drive where I've spent the last 2 years? Or maybe the cabin in Michigan where we spent Christmas while you told Olivia you were on a business trip?" Each word was a physical blow. 2 years. 2 years of our 3-year relationship. Christmas in Michigan, when he'd sent me daily texts about how boring his meetings were in Los Angeles. The murmurs among the guests grew louder. Phones were discreetly raised, capturing the unfolding drama. My professional reputation was imploding in real time. "Handle this," Richard Caldwell ordered his son, his voice low but carrying in the tense silence. Mrs. Caldwell appeared beside me, her fingers digging into my arm. "Let's get you inside, dear," she whispered urgently, "away from these vultures." But I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process the rapid destruction of everything I thought I knew. James was leading Veronica toward a private corner of the terrace, his hand still gripping her arm. She was allowing it, but her expression promised further escalation if thwarted. "I need to hear this," I said, shaking off Mrs. Caldwell's hand. "Olivia, please," she pleaded. "Think of appearances." "Appearances?" I echoed, suddenly struck by the absurdity. "My fiancé's mistress just crashed our engagement party, and you're worried about appearances?" Leaving Mrs. Caldwell stunned, I moved through the crowd that parted before me like the Red Sea. Conversations hushed as I passed. Expressions of pity and morbid fascination followed me to the corner where James and Veronica were engaged in a heated whisper argument. "Promised you would end it," Veronica was saying, her voice rising as I approached. "After the Wellington acquisition closed, you said—" "Olivia," James interrupted, seeing me. His face cycled through panic, calculation, and finally settled on contrite concern. "This isn't what it looks like." "Really?" I said, my voice eerily calm even to my own ears. "Because it looks like your mistress crashed our engagement party." Veronica's eyes narrowed. "Mistress? Is that what he told you I was?" James stepped between us. "Veronica, enough. You've made your point." "Have I?" She pushed past him to face me directly. "Did you know about the trust fund stipulation, Olivia? The reason for this whole engagement charade?" Her words hit like ice water. "What stipulation?" James's jaw tightened. "Don't listen to her." "James gets access to his grandfather's trust fund when he turns 35, Veronica continued, relentlessly. "Nearly $40 million, but only if he's married to a suitable partner approved by the trustees." The pieces clicked into horrible place. The rushed proposal 6 months before his 35th birthday. The insistence on a December wedding, just weeks after he would turn 35. The paperwork he wanted to discuss after the party. "You're a lawyer at a prestigious firm, from a respectable middle-class family," Veronica continued. "Perfect. On paper. I'm a cocktail waitress he met at a bachelor party. Not exactly trustee-approved material." A cold, clarifying rage washed over me. "Is this true, James?" His expression confirmed it before he even opened his mouth. "It's complicated, Olivia." "It's actually quite simple," came a new voice. I turned to find Arthur Pendleton, senior partner at James's father's law firm, and apparently one of the trustees of the fund in question. His weathered face was grave as he looked between us. The trust established by Theodore Caldwell has specific requirements for the inheritance distribution. Arthur, this isn't the time, James said through gritted teeth. On the contrary, Arthur replied coolly. Given the public nature of this, revelation, transparency seems appropriate. He turned to me. Ms. Morgan, I believe James intended to discuss the prenuptial agreement with you after the party. In light of current events, that conversation may be moot. Prenuptial agreement, of course. The paperwork James had mentioned. Veronica laughed bitterly. He promised me that once he secured the inheritance, he would divorce you and we would be together. She looked at me with something approaching pity. You were just a means to an end. The world had narrowed to this terrible moment. The party continued around us in awkward, stunned clusters. Richard Caldwell was doing damage control with the guests. Mrs. Caldwell had disappeared entirely. And I stood frozen between my fiancé and his mistress, being told that my entire relationship was a calculated financial strategy. Olivia. James reached for my hand, his voice dropping to that intimate tone he used when he wanted to persuade me of something. We can discuss this privately. I stepped back from his touch. I think enough has been kept private. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Don't you? You're upset? Upset? The word was so inadequate it was almost funny. James, I'm a corporate attorney. I structure deals and identify weaknesses for a living. A strange calm was settling over me, the kind that comes when shock gives way to analysis. And this? This was a poorly executed merger with obvious vulnerabilities. Arthur Pendleton's bushy eyebrows rose slightly, professional respect evident despite the circumstances. James's expression hardened. This is exactly why I chose you, he said, dropping the pretense of affection. Smart, strategic. I thought you'd understand the business angle. The business angle, I repeated flatly, of our engagement. $40 million, Olivia. We could have had a comfortable arrangement for a few years, then an amicable separation with generous terms for you. A few years of my life. That's what he had planned to purchase. A few years during which I might have had his children. Built. A life centered my world around a man who saw me as nothing more than a legal requirement to be fulfilled. I'll be keeping the ring, I said suddenly, my fingers touching the 5-carat diamond on my left hand. James actually laughed. That's a Caldwell family heirloom worth over $200,000. You'll be returning it tonight. Actually, interrupted Arthur Pendleton, legally, an engagement ring is a conditional gift, the condition being marriage. Since the engagement has clearly been. He glanced at Veronica. Compromised by Mr. Caldwell's actions, Ms. Morgan is within her rights to retain the ring as compensation for breach of promise. I had never particularly liked Arthur Pendleton during our previous interactions, but in that moment I could have hugged him. This is absurd, James snapped. My father won't stand for this. Your father, I said quietly, just lost control of a room full of Chicago's elite for the first time in his life. I don't think he has much standing at the moment. As if summoned by our discussion, Richard Caldwell approached, his face carefully composed but eyes blazing with fury. This situation will be contained, he informed us, his voice pitched low. Ms. Hayes will be leaving immediately. James will make appropriate apologies to key guests. And tomorrow, we will craft a suitable statement about a mutual decision to postpone the engagement. Postpone? I repeated incredulously. There is no engagement anymore, Mr. Caldwell. Don't be hasty, he replied, as if soothing a temperamental child. These matters can be managed. The calculation in his eyes mirrored his son's so perfectly that I wondered how I had never seen it before. The Caldwell men viewed emotions as inconveniences to be managed, relationships as assets to be leveraged. "I'm not one of your corporate takeovers," I said. "You can't just restructure me into compliance." Veronica, who had been watching this exchange with growing impatience, suddenly turned to James. "This isn't what you promised. You said once, she knew you would end it, that we would finally be together openly." The desperation in her voice sparked a moment of genuine sympathy in me. She had been deceived as thoroughly as I had, just in different ways. James's expression confirmed what I already suspected. Veronica had been fed as many convenient lies as I had. "You actually believed him," I said to her, not unkindly. Her eyes flashed with anger, but it wasn't directed at me. 2 years, she said. 2 years of just a little longer, and once everything is in place. Richard Caldwell checked his watch impatiently. "Enough of this spectacle. James, escort Ms. Hayes out through the service entrance. I'll announce that the party is concluding. Early due to your sudden illness." "And what about the trust?" James demanded. "After this disaster, the trustees will never approve." Arthur Pendleton cleared his throat. "Indeed, the circumstances are problematic." I looked at the 4 people in front of me. James, caught in his own deception. Veronica, used and discarded. Richard, calculating damage control. And Arthur, representing the financial prize that had motivated this entire charade. This bizarre tableau surrounding me at what was supposed to be the happiest celebration of my life. And in that moment, as the shock began to recede, the first seedling of an idea took root. A dangerous, audacious idea that spoke to something cold and calculating that I hadn't known existed within me. "The trustees require James to be married to a suitable partner," I said slowly, testing the concept aloud. "But what exactly constitutes suitable?" Arthur adjusted his glasses. "The terms specify a partner of appropriate social standing, education, and moral character. And who determines those criteria?" "The trustees have discretionary authority to evaluate candidates." I nodded, pieces falling into place. "And how many trustees are there?" 3, Arthur replied. "Myself, Richard, and James's uncle William." A 2/3 majority then. Already I could see pathways, strategies, leverage points. The lawyer in me was awakening, analyzing the situation not as a heartbroken fiancé, but as a tactician identifying openings. "I'd like to see the trust documents," I said. James barked a laugh. "Absolutely not." But Arthur was already considering it. "Under the circumstances, transparency might be advisable. The documents are a matter of private family business, but given Ms. Morgan's professional standing and her unique position, granting limited access could be appropriate." Richard. Caldwell's expression darkened. "This is not the time or place for legal consultations." "On the contrary," I said, finding my voice growing stronger. "This seems exactly the right time to understand the legal frameworks that have shaped the last 3 years of my life without my knowledge." Something shifted in that moment, a rebalancing of power that was almost palpable. For the first time since Veronica had burst through those doors, I felt a measure of control returning. "Everyone back to the party," Richard commanded. "We'll sort this out privately tomorrow." "Too late for privacy," I replied, glancing meaningfully at the guests who were still watching our corner drama with poorly disguised interest. "But you're right about one thing. We should return to the party." I turned to Veronica. "Would you care for some champagne? I believe we both have some celebrating to do." The shock on their faces was almost worth the humiliation I'd endured. As I linked my arm with a stunned Veronica and led her toward the bar, I heard Arthur Pendleton chuckle softly behind us. "Remarkable woman," he murmured, just loud enough for me to hear. Absolutely remarkable. Little did they know, this was just the beginning. Over the next 72 hours, I would dismantle the Caldwell inheritance scheme piece by piece, turning their own legal mechanisms against them. The prenuptial agreement they had prepared for me would become the blueprint for their undoing, because they had made one critical miscalculation. They had chosen a corporate attorney specialized in identifying contractual vulnerabilities, then given her every motivation to exploit them. What came next would redefine the meaning of suitable, partner, and ensure that James Caldwell's inheritance would flow exactly where it would hurt him most. The grand ballroom of the Harrington had transformed from a celebration venue to a disaster zone in the span of 20 minutes. Guests huddled in clusters, whispering behind manicured hands while pretending not to stare as Veronica and I approached the bar. The string quartet had resumed playing, but the melody seemed oddly discordant now, like the soundtrack to a film where everything was about to unravel. "Champagne for both of us," I told the bartender, whose professional mask slipped, just enough to reveal his fascination with the unfolding drama. Veronica eyed me warily as I handed her a flute. "What are you doing?" "Getting to know my fiancé's other woman," I replied, keeping my voice light despite the lead weight in my chest. "Seems overdue, doesn't it?" She took the champagne, but didn't drink. "I didn't come here to befriend you." "No, you came here to blow up my engagement party. Mission accomplished." I took a deliberate sip, forcing steadiness into my hands. "The question is, what happens next?" Across the room, James and his father were engaged in what appeared to be a heated argument. Mrs. Caldwell had reappeared and was desperately trying to usher important guests toward the exit, with talk of James feeling unwell. Arthur Pendleton watched it all with the detached interest of someone witnessing an interesting legal case unfold rather than a family crisis. "He was never going to leave you for me," Veronica said suddenly, her voice barely audible over the quartet. "I see that now." The raw pain in her voice resonated with my own. Two women, completely different in circumstance, united by the same man's capacity for deception. "How did you meet?" I asked, genuinely curious about the parallel life James had been leading. Veronica's laugh was bitter. "Exactly where you'd expect. Serving drinks at his friend's bachelor party. Such a cliché, right? Rich guy, cocktail waitress." She finally took a sip of champagne. But it wasn't like that at first. He kept coming back to the lounge just to talk. He seemed different from the other men like him. "They always do," I murmured, thinking of how James had pursued me after we met at a charity auction, how his persistence had seemed charming rather than calculated. "When did you find out about me?" I asked. 6 months in. He said you were just a convenient relationship, that his family expected certain things, connections with certain types of people." She looked at me with a mixture of defiance and apology. "He said you knew the score, that it was basically a business arrangement." Each revelation was another shard of glass, but I maintained my composure. 3 years of my life reduced to a convenient relationship with the right type of person. Every anniversary dinner, every weekend trip, every whispered promise, all calculated moves in James's inheritance strategy. "And the trust fund? When did you learn about that?" "About a year ago. He was drunk after a fight with his father. Let it slip that he needed to get married to access his grandfather's money." Veronica's expression hardened. "That's when the timeline started. Suddenly, he needed to propose to you by June, marry by December right after his birthday. He swore once he had the money, he'd divorce you with a generous settlement, and we could be together openly." I nodded, pieces falling into place. "Let me guess, he had you sign something? An agreement promising you a portion of the inheritance once he received it." Her surprise confirmed my suspicion. "How did you know?" "Because James is an attorney, and his father is Richard Caldwell. They don't leave loose ends." I finished my champagne, the bubbles bitter on my tongue. May I see it? The agreement. Veronica hesitated, then reached into her small clutch. I brought it. It's why I came tonight. He stopped answering my calls last week, and She swallowed hard. I needed to remind him of his promises. The document she handed me was folded into a tight square, as if she'd been clutching it like a talisman. I carefully unfolded it, professional instincts taking over as I scanned the legal language. It was amateurish by Caldwell standards. Clearly, James had drafted it himself without his father's knowledge. A promise that upon receipt of his inheritance, James would pay Veronica Hayes a lump sum of $3 million in exchange for her discretion and termination of personal relationship. No witness signatures, no notarization. Legally dubious at best, but revealing in its details. This mentions the Wellington acquisition, I noted, spotting a clause about timing. The payment was contingent on that deal closing first? Veronica nodded. He said once that deal went through, his father would be distracted enough for him to manage the transition smoothly. Translation: Richard Caldwell would be too busy with a major business deal to notice his son's personal machinations. The Wellington acquisition had closed just 3 weeks ago, which explained the sudden rush toward our December wedding date. Did you know, I said, refolding the document carefully, that in contract law, there's a principle called consideration? For an agreement to be binding, both parties must give up something of value. James is promising money, but what are you giving in return? Discretion is too vague to enforce. Veronica stared at me. You're analyzing this like a lawyer. I am a lawyer. Corporate contracts, specifically. I handed the paper back to her. And this? This isn't worth the paper it's printed on. He never intended to pay you. The color drained from her face. You don't know that. I know James, and now I know what he's capable of. I gestured toward where he stood with his father, both of them watching us with barely concealed anxiety. Ask yourself, if he would use me for 3 years to secure his inheritance, what makes you think he wouldn't use you too? Before she could respond, Cassandra appeared at my side, her expression a mixture of concern and protective fury. Olivia, your apartment is being packed up right now, she said without preamble. What? What are you talking about? I just got a text from Emma. She went by to pick up your overnight bag like you asked, and there were movers there. They said they had instructions to pack everything and place it in storage until further notice. Cold rage flooded my system. James was already erasing me, methodically removing my existence from his life mere minutes after being exposed. Let me guess, I said, my voice dangerously calm. The movers are from Caldwell Properties. Cassandra nodded grimly. Emma tried to stop them, but they have paperwork. Said it came directly from James. Of course they do. I turned to look directly at James, who was now watching us with growing apprehension. Our eyes locked across the room. Excuse me for a moment. I strode across the ballroom, aware of every eye tracking my movement. James straightened as I approached, adjusting. His tie in a nervous gesture I now recognized as his tell when preparing for confrontation. Movers, James? Really? I kept my voice low, but my eyes conveyed my fury. I'm not even gone from the party, and you're already clearing out my things? Richard stepped forward, ever the crisis manager. A misunderstanding. Given the situation, we thought it best to expedite the transition. The transition, I repeated. You make it sound like a corporate restructuring rather than throwing a woman's belongings into storage without her consent. You'll have full access to your things, Richard assured me with patronizing smoothness. Once emotions have cooled. Stop the movers, I said flatly to James. Now. He hesitated, looking to his father for direction. Always the dutiful son when it mattered. I don't think that's... Richard began. Either the movers stop now, I interrupted, or I walk over to the Wellington family in the East Corner and explain exactly why their acquisition was so important to your timeline. James paled. The Wellington deal was his father's crowning achievement, and apparently critical to their inheritance scheme as well. "You wouldn't," he said, but uncertainty tinged his voice. "Try me." I pulled out my phone. One call to the firm's ethics committee would also be interesting. I wonder how they'd feel about a partner using client information to time personal. Financial strategies. James grabbed his own phone. "Fine. I'll call them off." He stepped away, punching numbers with unnecessary force. Richard's eyes narrowed, reassessing me as if seeing me clearly for the first time. "You're upset. Understandable. But threats won't serve anyone well in the long run." "Neither will treating me like a problem to be managed," I replied evenly. "You raised a son who spent 3 years lying to my face as part of a financial strategy. Did you really expect me to just quietly disappear when exposed?" Arthur Pendleton, who had been observing from a discreet distance, approached with 2 fresh champagne flutes. "Perhaps this conversation would benefit from a brief pause," he suggested, offering us drinks with practiced diplomacy. I accepted the champagne, but Richard waved it away impatiently. "Arthur, this is hardly the time for social niceties." "On the contrary," Arthur replied mildly. "When emotions run high, protocol becomes more important, not less." He turned to me with unexpected kindness. "Ms. Morgan, may I offer my personal apology for this distasteful situation. Whatever the circumstances, you deserved better." Coming from someone of Arthur's standing, senior partner, trustee, and Richard's contemporary, the acknowledgement carried weight. I inclined my head slightly in acceptance. "The movers are leaving," James announced, returning to our group. "Satisfied?" Hardly the word I'd choose," I replied, "but it's a start." Mrs. Caldwell appeared, her social mask firmly back in place despite the strain evident around her eyes. "Most of the guests have departed," she informed us with brittle cheer. "I've cited a sudden migraine on James's part." "How creative," I murmured. She flinched slightly but pressed on. "Olivia, dear, my driver can take you home whenever you're ready. I'm sure you'd like some privacy now." The dismissal was clear. It was time for the embarrassing fiancé to exit the scene so the Caldwell family could begin damage control. "Actually," Arthur interjected smoothly, "I've invited Ms. Morgan to join me for a nightcap in the hotel's library bar. There are matters regarding the trust that would benefit from her legal perspective." Richard's head snapped toward his longtime friend. "Arthur, that's completely inappropriate. Family matters involve Ms. Morgan quite directly," Arthur finished firmly. "Given the circumstances, transparency seems the wisest course." I studied Arthur with new interest. His intervention couldn't be purely altruistic. Nothing in the Caldwell orbit ever was. But his willingness to challenge Richard suggested competing agendas I hadn't previously considered. "I'd be happy to join you," I told Arthur, ignoring the thunderous expression on Richard's face. James moved closer, lowering his voice. "Olivia, be reasonable. There's nothing to be gained from dragging this out." "On the contrary," I replied, matching his tone. "I think there's quite a lot to be gained. You just never expected me to be the one gaining it." As I turned to leave with Arthur, I caught sight of Veronica still standing by the bar, watching our exchange with wary fascination. On impulse, I called to her. "Veronica, would you care to join us as well?" Her eyes widened in surprise, but after a moment's hesitation, she nodded and moved to follow. "This is absurd," James hissed. "You can't seriously be—" "Can I?" I interrupted. "You brought both of us into your inheritance scheme without our knowledge. It seems only fair we both understand exactly what we've been part of." Richard stepped forward, abandoning pretense. "Arthur, as your friend and co-trustee, I strongly advise against this course of action." Arthur adjusted his glasses calmly. "Noted. However, as senior trustee, I'm exercising my discretionary authority. The young ladies deserve answers." With that, he offered an arm to each of us, a courtly gesture from another era, and led us away from the Caldwells, through the remaining shocked guests, and toward the ornate elevator that would take us to the hotel's exclusive library bar. As the elevator doors closed on James and Richard's identical expressions of controlled fury, I felt the first genuine smile of the evening tug at my lips. "Well," said Arthur as we ascended, "this has certainly been the most eventful engagement. Party I've attended in 40 years of practice." "You're enjoying this," I observed, studying his composed profile. His eyes crinkled slightly. "At my age, Ms. Morgan, genuine surprises are rare and therefore to be savored. Though I do regret the personal pain this has caused you both," he added, nodding to include Veronica. The library bar occupied the Harrington's entire top floor, a throwback to old Chicago with its leather chairs, mahogany shelves, and hushed atmosphere. At this hour, it was nearly empty, allowing Arthur to secure us a private corner with views of the city lights. Once we were settled with drinks, Macallan 18 for Arthur, gin and tonic for me, vodka soda for Veronica, he removed a slim leather portfolio from his briefcase. "The relevant sections of Theodore Caldwell's trust," he explained, extracting several pages. "Established in 1982 for his grandson James, with specific conditions for distribution." I accepted the documents eagerly, professional instincts overriding personal turmoil. The legal language was dense but precise, typical of old money estate planning. I scanned for the key provisions, quickly finding the marriage requirement. "The beneficiary shall receive full distribution of trust assets upon reaching 35 years of age, provided said beneficiary is at that time joined in. Legal marriage to a suitable partner," I read aloud. "That's surprisingly straightforward." Arthur nodded. Theodore was direct in most matters. The complexity lies in the definition of suitable. I flipped to the next page, finding the relevant clause. "Suitability shall be determined by majority, vote of appointed trustees, considering factors including but not limited to moral character, family background, education, and social standing." Remarkably subjective, I noted, professional interest momentarily overtaking personal betrayal. "This gives the trustees almost unlimited discretion." "Precisely," Arthur confirmed. "Theodore didn't trust James's judgment, with good reason. It seems he wanted checks and balances on any fortune hunter who might target his grandson." Veronica shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "And you're one of 3 trustees," I continued, "along with Richard and William Caldwell." Arthur nodded. "Though William has been living in Switzerland for the past decade, he generally defers to our recommendations. A 2-person effective majority, then. I filed that information away. So James needed a wife who would pass trustee approval," I summarized. "A corporate attorney from a respectable middle class, family, educated, professional, no scandals." I couldn't keep the bitterness from my voice. "A worthy breeding partner for the Caldwell line." Arthur didn't disagree. "You were an excellent candidate. Your firm stands among Chicago's elite. Your academic credentials are impeccable. Your family, while not wealthy, has a solid reputation. How fortunate for James to find such a perfectly suitable match," I said dryly. Yes, Richard was quite pleased with the selection. The casual confirmation that my 3-year relationship had been evaluated and approved by James's father like a business acquisition was another twist of the knife. "And what about me?" Veronica asked suddenly. "Where do I fit in this grand plan?" Arthur regarded her thoughtfully. "That, young lady, is the question at hand. James clearly maintained your relationship throughout his engagement, a significant risk to his inheritance prospects. He promised me—" She stopped, seeming to realize how naive the words sounded. "Yes, promises," Arthur mused. "The Caldwell men are quite liberal with those." He turned back to me. "The trust requires marriage to access the funds, but interestingly, It doesn't stipulate maintaining that marriage for any specific duration. I caught his meaning immediately. So, James could marry me, receive the inheritance, then divorce me shortly thereafter. With an appropriate prenuptial agreement in place, yes. Arthur sipped his scotch. I suspect that was the strategy Richard advised. And the prenup would have been the paperwork James wanted to discuss after the party, I concluded, the pieces fitting together with nauseating clarity. Veronica's expression hardened as she absorbed this information. So, I was supposed to wait quietly in the background while he married you, secured his money, then divorced you and returned to me with millions. It appears so, I agreed, though I doubt the returning to you part was genuine. More likely, he'd have provided some financial settlement to ensure your continued discretion, then moved on entirely. The truth of this assessment showed in her eyes, despite her reluctance to accept it. But now, Arthur said, the situation has changed dramatically. James's deception has been publicly exposed. The trustees must consider whether he remains worthy of his grandfather's legacy at all. I looked up sharply. The trust allows for withholding the inheritance entirely? Arthur nodded gravely. In cases of moral turpitude or demonstrable character failings, yes. Theodore was quite concerned about James's proclivities even from an early age. This was a new angle I hadn't considered. Not just James's choice of wife, but James himself was subject to trustee approval. Richard would never agree to disinherit his son, I pointed out. Perhaps not, Arthur conceded. But William might be persuaded, especially given tonight's spectacle. The Caldwell name means a great deal to him. The strategic implications were expanding rapidly in my mind. Even if James found another suitable partner quickly, the trustees could still deny him based on character concerns. Indeed, Theodore's intention was to ensure his fortune passed to worthy hands. Arthur's eyes twinkled slightly. He was quite progressive for his era. The trust doesn't actually specify that James must be the ultimate recipient, only that he has the first opportunity to qualify. My legal mind seized on this. There are contingent beneficiaries? Several. Charitable foundations, primarily. And a provision for distribution to a spouse in certain circumstances, even without James's qualification. I nearly choked on my gin. A spouse could inherit directly? Without James? Arthur nodded. If the trustees determined the spouse exhibited exceptional character and responsibility while James himself failed to meet Theodore's standards. Veronica leaned forward. What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Pendleton? He spread his hands innocently. I'm merely explaining the parameters of a complex legal document to two intelligent women who have been wronged by its primary beneficiary. But his eyes told a different story, one of opportunity, alliance, and perhaps a long-standing disagreement with Richard Caldwell's methods. My mind was racing now, connecting possibilities, identifying leverage points. The trust requires James to be married to a suitable partner by his 35th birthday to receive the distribution. That's 6 weeks from now. Correct. If he's not married by then, or if the trustees deem him morally unfit, the inheritance goes to the contingent beneficiaries. Also correct. But a spouse, even one married to him briefly, could potentially receive the distribution directly if the trustees approved. Arthur inclined his head. In theory, though such a scenario would be unprecedented. I turned to Veronica, who was following this exchange with growing comprehension. You've been with James for 2 years. In that time, did he ever mention a prenuptial agreement to you? Any paperwork at all regarding marriage? She shook her head slowly. No. He said we'd eventually get married, but always, someday, never with specific plans. Because he never intended to marry you, I concluded. You were the mistress, not the suitable partner. Her face flushed with anger and humiliation. I never wanted his money. I just wanted... She stopped, unable to articulate exactly what she had wanted from a relationship built on deception. You wanted to believe you were special, I finished gently. That he chose you for yourself, not for what you represented. I understood that feeling all too well now. Arthur cleared his throat. Ladies, it's getting late, and you both have had a tremendously difficult evening. Might I suggest we reconvene tomorrow after you've had time to process? But the lawyer, in me, was fully awake now, calculating possibilities, assembling strategy. One more question, I said. The trust documents, can I get a complete copy? Arthur hesitated for the first time. That would be unusual. Family trusts are typically confidential. So is the relationship between attorney and client, yet James had no trouble using my career to advance his financial interests, I countered. Consider it professional courtesy between colleagues. After a moment's consideration, Arthur nodded. I'll have copies sent to your office tomorrow. Discretion would be appreciated, of course. Of course. As we prepared to leave, Veronica touched my arm hesitantly. Why are you including me in this? You could have let them throw me out. It was a fair question. By all conventional standards, I should despise this woman who had been sleeping with my fiancé for 2/3 of our relationship. Because we've both been used as pawns in their game, I answered honestly. And I've found that pawns can be quite powerful when they move together. Arthur called for his car to drive us each home, refusing our protests with old-world insistence. As we waited in the hotel lobby, carefully avoiding the lingering wedding planners dismantling what was to have been my perfect engagement party, my phone buzzed with a text from James. We need to talk. What Arthur told you isn't the full story. Meet me for breakfast tomorrow, 8 a.m. at Lockwood. As if we were just having a minor disagreement about wedding details. As if discovering his dual life was something that could be smoothed over with Eggs Benedict and his practiced charm. I showed the message to Veronica. Has he contacted you? Too? She checked her phone and laughed bitterly. Radio silence. Typical. He's panicking, I observed, trying to salvage what he can. What will you do? She asked. I considered the question carefully, the skeleton of a plan taking shape in my mind. I think, I said slowly, I'll meet him for breakfast, after I've had a chance to review those trust documents more thoroughly. Veronica's eyes narrowed with cautious interest. And then? And then we'll see just how suitable a partner James Caldwell truly deserves. Arthur's car arrived, a gleaming black Bentley that seemed appropriate to his dignified persona. As he helped us in, he paused to hand me his personal card. Call me directly with any questions about the documents, he said. Richard will be managing the situation aggressively from his end. Why are you helping us? I finally asked the question that had been nagging at me all evening. Arthur's expression softened slightly. Let's just say I've witnessed the Caldwell approach to problems for over 40 years. I've cleaned up many messes created by their particular blend of entitlement and expedience. He glanced toward the hotel where the party debris was still being cleared. Perhaps it's time they faced consequences rather than arrangements. With that cryptic statement, he closed the car door and instructed his driver to take me home first. As the Bentley glided through Chicago's late-night streets, I leaned back against the leather seat, exhaustion finally catching up with me. The evening replayed in fragments, Veronica's dramatic entrance, James's calculated lies, the trust stipulations that had shaped my relationship without my knowledge. But beneath the pain and betrayal, something else was emerging. A cold, precise clarity that reminded me why I had become a corporate attorney in the first place, the ability to identify vulnerabilities in complex systems and leverage them to my client's advantage. Except this time, I was my own client. and James Caldwell had just provided me with the perfect opportunity to demonstrate exactly why he should have been more careful about choosing a suitable partner to deceive. By the time the car pulled up to my apartment building, I had the broad strokes of a strategy mapped out. It would require precision timing, careful documentation, and perhaps most challengingly, an alliance with the woman who had unwittingly shared my fiancé for the past 2 years. But if successful, it would ensure that Theodore Caldwell's fortune ended up exactly where it would cause James the most anguish, and where perhaps it would do the most good. "We've arrived, Ms. Morgan," the driver announced, opening my door, with practiced courtesy. I stepped out into the cool Chicago night, the city lights blurring slightly as fatigue and emotional overload took their toll. Up in my apartment, I would find half-packed boxes, the physical manifestation of James's attempt to erase me from his life at the first sign of trouble. But he had underestimated me in the most fundamental way possible. He had selected me precisely for the qualities that would now become his undoing: intelligence, strategic thinking, and an intimate understanding of contract law. Tomorrow would begin with breakfast at Lockwood, where James would attempt to charm and manipulate me back into compliance. He would offer explanations, justifications, perhaps even a modified version of his original plan with slightly better terms for me. What he wouldn't expect was for me to arrive with a counter-proposal, one that would use his own grandfather's trust provisions to deliver a lesson in consequences that the Caldwell family would never forget. As I rode the elevator to my floor, I found myself wondering what my grandmother would say about this situation. Her words from years ago echoed in my mind: "Never underestimate a woman who knows exactly what she's worth." For the first time since Veronica Hayes had burst through those terrace doors, I felt the flicker of a genuine smile. By the time this was over, James Caldwell would know exactly what I was worth, and exactly what his betrayal had cost him. The Lockwood restaurant at the Palmer House exuded old-world Chicago elegance, all polished mahogany, crisp white tablecloths, and discreet service. At precisely 7:55 a.m., I stepped through its ornate entrance, dressed in what Cassandra had dubbed my corporate assassin outfit: a sleek charcoal suit with a blood-red silk blouse, hair pulled back in a severe knot. The maitre d' recognized me immediately. "Ms. Morgan, Mr. Caldwell is already seated." He gestured toward a secluded corner table where James sat reviewing documents, a cup of coffee untouched beside him. "Thank you." I straightened my shoulders, mentally reviewing the strategy I'd refined during my sleepless night. James looked up as I approached, the shadows under his eyes suggesting his night had been no more restful than mine. He stood, his smile strained as he leaned in for what appeared to be a habitual cheek kiss. I stepped back, keeping the table between us. "Olivia," he began, "thank you for—" "I have a meeting at 9:30, I interrupted, checking my watch as I took my seat. "So let's be efficient with our time." His expression flickered with irritation before settling into the conciliatory mask I recognized from his client negotiations. "Of course." He waited for me to order coffee before continuing. "About last night?" "Last night," I cut in again, "I discovered that my 3-year relationship was an elaborate qualification strategy for your inheritance. That my fiancé has been maintaining a parallel relationship for 2 years, and that you were planning to divorce me shortly after securing your grandfather's money." I stirred my coffee with precise movements. "Did I miss anything important?" James had the decency to wince. "When you put it that way, it sounds calculated." "It was calculated. It's more complicated than that," he insisted, leaning forward. "Yes, the trust has specific requirements. And yes, I needed to meet those requirements to access my inheritance. But what developed between us was real, Olivia." I met his gaze, steadily. "Real enough that you were sleeping with another woman for 2/3 of our relationship." He looked away first. "That was a mistake. A complication I didn't handle well." "A complication." I repeated flatly. Is that what we're calling deception and infidelity now? James sighed, running a hand through his hair, a calculated gesture of vulnerability I'd once found endearing. I'm not proud of how I managed the situation with Veronica. But you and what we built together, that wasn't fake. What exactly was real about it, James? The part where you pursued me because I fit your grandfather's criteria for a suitable partner? Or the part where you planned to divorce me once you secured your inheritance? He flinched. Arthur shouldn't have shared those details with you. Someone needed to be honest with me. It certainly wasn't going to be you. I sipped my coffee, allowing the silence to stretch uncomfortably. The waiter approached, but James waved him away. Olivia, I know you're hurt and angry. You have every right to be. But there's still a path forward for us. Is there? Yes. His expression brightened slightly at what he perceived as an opening. The trust situation is real. I need to be married to access my inheritance. That hasn't changed. But we can renegotiate terms that benefit us both. I raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Encouraged, he continued, instead of the prenup I was going to propose, we can sign a postnuptial agreement guaranteeing you 20% of the inheritance, that's $8 million, in the event of divorce, regardless of when it happens. How generous, I remarked dryly. And Veronica? His expression hardened. Veronica is no longer in the picture. What she did last night was unacceptable. What she did, I noted, was tell the truth. Something you seem pathologically incapable of doing. James leaned back, frustration evident. I'm trying to salvage something here, Olivia. $8 million is a significant offer. For 3 years of my life and my professional reputation, it seems rather inadequate. I regarded him coolly. Besides, I've had a chance to review the trust provisions more thoroughly. There are alternative approaches worth considering. Wariness crept into his expression. What alternative approaches? I removed a document from my briefcase and slid it across the table. My counterproposal. He scanned the first page, his face darkening. This is absurd. You want 50% of the inheritance? That's $20 million. Keep reading. His eyes widened as he reached the second page. A binding commitment that I remain completely uninvolved in allocation decisions? You want control over my inheritance? Joint control, I corrected, with an independent trustee to resolve any disputes. This is highway robbery, he sputtered. No, James. This is consequences. I leaned forward, dropping the professional veneer momentarily. You used me for 3 years as part of a financial strategy. You maintained another relationship the entire time. You planned to discard me once I'd served my purpose. My voice remained steady despite the emotion behind the words. Those actions have a price. He pushed the document back toward me. My father would never allow this. Your father isn't the one facing a potential public lawsuit for fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and breach of promise. I smiled thinly. Imagine the depositions, James. Your emails about the suitable partner requirements. Your text messages to Veronica while we were on vacation together. The timing of your proposal exactly 6 months before your 35th birthday deadline. The color drained from his face. You wouldn't. Wouldn't I? Your family places enormous value on public reputation. How would Richard Caldwell react to the Chicago Tribune headline? Caldwell heir used fiancé in 3-year inheritance scheme. James's jaw tightened, calculation replacing shock. What's your real game here, Olivia? This isn't just about money. Perceptive, I acknowledged. You're right. It's not just about money. It's about accountability. I gathered my documents. You have 24 hours to consider my terms. After that, I'll be pursuing alternative arrangements. He caught my wrist as I stood to leave. What alternative arrangements? I removed his hand deliberately. Let's just say I've discovered some interesting provisions in your grandfather's trust. Provisions regarding alternate distribution paths when the primary beneficiary demonstrates moral turpitude. The flash of genuine fear in his eyes was deeply satisfying. 24 hours, James. I suggest you use them wisely. The mid-morning sun had warmed the Chicago streets by the time I exited the Palmer House, the familiar skyline a reminder that the city continued its business despite personal earthquakes. I checked my watch, 8:55 a.m., exactly on schedule. Pulled out my phone and dialed. He rejected the initial offer as expected, I informed Cassandra when she answered. Set up the meeting with Veronica for noon. Already done, she confirmed. She's nervous but committed. Are you sure about this, Liv? It's a risky play. The best ones usually are. I hailed a taxi. See you at the office. Barrett Frost occupied the 35th floor of a sleek downtown building, its reception area designed to intimidate with soaring ceilings and minimalist furnishings. I'd arranged for Cassandra to bring Veronica to my office through the private elevator, avoiding curious colleagues who would undoubtedly have heard about last night's spectacle. My assistant Eva met me at the elevator with careful neutrality. Your guests will arrive at noon. Arthur Pendleton called twice this morning. The files you requested are on your desk, and Mr. Roberts wants to know if you'll be joining the Wilson deposition prep at 2. Tell Daniel I'll be there, I replied, maintaining professional normalcy despite the chaos of my personal life. And schedule a call with Arthur for 4 p.m. Eva nodded, her expression softening slightly. The post-it note means the private matter we discussed is handled. The private matter being the discreet security service I'd engaged at 6 a.m. to ensure no further unauthorized access to my apartment. Another example of Eva's invaluable efficiency. Thank you. In my office, I found the promised stack of documents, complete copies of Theodore Caldwell's trust, courtesy of Arthur Pendleton. I spent the next 2 hours immersed in legal analysis, highlighting key provisions and mapping out contingencies. By the time Cassandra texted to announce their arrival, I had a comprehensive strategy prepared. Veronica looked different in daylight, younger, somehow, and more vulnerable in simple jeans and a sweater rather than the dramatic red dress of the previous night. She entered my office with visible hesitation, eyes widening slightly at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Thank you for coming, I said, gesturing to the seating area away from my desk where Cassandra had arranged coffee and pastries. Wasn't sure I would, Veronica admitted, perching on the edge of a leather chair. This is weird. Agreed. I smiled slightly. But necessary, I think. Cassandra took a seat beside Veronica, her protective instincts clearly extended, to this unexpected ally. I've explained the broad strokes of what we're considering, but Olivia should walk you through the details. I nodded, gathering the relevant documents. Did James contact you after last night? Radio silence, Veronica confirmed bitterly. Though his father's lawyer called this morning with a settlement offer, if I sign an NDA about our relationship. Gregory Phillips? I guessed. That's him. Slimy guy? Talks like he's doing me a favor. He specializes in making problems disappear for the Caldwells, I explained. What did he offer? $200,000, she replied with a hollow laugh. For 2 years of my life and a promise never to speak about James again. I shook my head. Insulting but not surprising. The Caldwells consistently undervalue emotional damage while overvaluing their own reputations. I told him to shove it, Veronica said with unexpected fire. I'm done being managed. I studied her with new respect. Good, because what I'm proposing is significantly more complicated than simply accepting hush money. For the next 30 minutes, I outlined the plan I'd formulated during my sleepless night, refined during my review of the trust documents, and tested during my breakfast confrontation with James. As I spoke, Veronica's expression shifted from skepticism to cautious interest to stunned disbelief. "That's audacious," she said finally. "It's legally sound," I assured her. "Aggressive, certainly, but within the parameters of the trust provisions." "If it works," Cassandra added, "it solves both your situations elegantly. If it fails, we're no worse off than we are now," I finished. "James has already shown his true character to both of us. This simply ensures he faces appropriate consequences." Veronica stood, pacing to the window. "Why include me at all? You could execute most of this plan without me." It was a fair question, one Cassandra had asked as well when I'd called her at 3 a.m. to discuss strategy. "3 reasons," I replied honestly. "First, practical necessity. Your testimony regarding James's promises and timeline is crucial evidence. Second, ethical consideration. You've been manipulated as thoroughly as I have, just in different ways. And third," I hesitated, trying to articulate the strange bond that had formed between us. "You deserve restitution too." She turned from the window, studying me intently. "You really are nothing like he described you." I raised an eyebrow. "And how did he describe me? Cold? Strategic? Convenient?" She shrugged apologetically. "His perfect corporate wife who cared more about career advancement than emotional connection." The description stung, though it shouldn't have after everything else. "And you?" "The passionate escape. The real connection." Veronica's laugh was hollow. "Turns out we were both just playing assigned roles in his inheritance. Theater." "Well," I said, gathering the documents, "perhaps it's time for a role reversal." By the time Veronica left, we had a tentative agreement and a timeline for implementation. Cassandra remained behind, her expression troubled. "Arthur Pendleton is a critical variable in this," she reminded me. "If he's playing his own angle." "He is," I confirmed. "But our interests align for now. The Caldwells have clearly crossed him somehow, and he's using this situation as leverage. Risky to build a strategy on someone else's agenda. Hence the contingency plans." I checked my watch. "I need to prep for the Wilson deposition." Cassandra nodded, understanding my need to maintain professional normalcy despite personal turmoil. "I'll handle the documentation for Veronica. Dinner tonight to finalize details?" "Perfect." The rest of the workday passed in a haze of professional obligations performed on autopilot. Colleagues were carefully not mentioning last night's dramatic engagement party implosion, though the sidelong glances and hushed conversations that stopped when I entered rooms told me the news had spread. Chicago's legal community was tightly interconnected, and a scandal involving the Caldwell family would travel at light speed. At 4 p.m. sharp, my phone rang. "Ms. Morgan," Arthur Pendleton's distinguished voice greeted me. "I trust you received the documents." "I did, thank you." "Most illuminating." "And your breakfast meeting with James?" News traveled fast indeed. Predictable, he offered a financial settlement in exchange for proceeding with the original plan. Arthur's chuckle held little humor. Richard's standard approach: throw money at inconvenient emotions. A pause. "I understand you've been in contact with Ms. Hayes as well." I kept my voice neutral. "We have mutual interests in resolving this situation fairly." "Indeed." Another significant pause. "Theodore Caldwell was a good man, you know. Principled in a way his son and grandson never managed to be. He would be. Disappointed in how they've approached this inheritance matter." "You knew him?" "Well, we were at university together. Friends for over 50 years until his passing." The personal connection explained much about Arthur's willingness to challenge Richard's authority. The trust was designed to ensure James wouldn't squander his legacy not as a tool for manipulation. Yet here we are. Yes, Arthur agreed grimly. Here we are, which brings me to the purpose of my call. The trustees are meeting tomorrow to discuss recent developments and their impact on James's qualification status. This was moving faster than I'd anticipated. All 3 trustees? William is flying in from Zurich specifically. The situation has concerned him. Opportunity was presenting itself ahead of schedule. Would it be appropriate for affected parties to address the trustees directly? It would be unusual, Arthur admitted, but given the extraordinary circumstances, not unprecedented. If you and perhaps Miss Hayes were available at 2 p.m. tomorrow. We'll be there, I confirmed, mind racing with accelerated timelines. After completing the call, I immediately texted Cassandra and Veronica to adjust our planning session. By 7 p.m., the 3 of us were gathered in Cassandra's apartment, takeout containers scattered across her dining table as we refined our approach. The trustee meeting changes everything, Cassandra noted, highlighting sections of the trust agreement. We need to be prepared for direct questioning about James's conduct. And about our own intentions, I added. William Caldwell is the wild card here. Arthur seems to be on our side, at least temporarily, but Richard will obviously support James regardless of his behavior. Veronica looked overwhelmed. I'm not a lawyer. What if they twist my words? Just tell the truth, I advised. About when you met James, what he promised you, and especially about the timeline of his proposal to me coinciding with his inheritance deadline. That's the key evidence of his manipulation. My phone buzzed with a text from James. Need to talk. Your proposal is impossible, but we can find middle ground. Dinner tonight? James again? Cassandra guessed from my expression. I nodded, showing them the message. He's getting desperate, Veronica observed with surprising insight. When he goes quiet, he's confident. When he keeps reaching out, he's scrambling. Exactly, I agreed. And his desperation works in our favor. Are you going to meet him? Cassandra asked. I considered the strategic implications. No, let him stew overnight. By tomorrow's trustee meeting, he'll be off balance. By midnight, we had finalized our approach, prepared our documentation, and rehearsed key points for the trustee meeting. As Veronica gathered her things to leave, she paused. Can I ask you something personal? I nodded, curious. Did you love him? Really love him, I mean. The question caught me off guard with its directness. I thought I did, I answered honestly, but I'm not sure I ever really knew him. She nodded slowly. Same. It's like we were both in relationships with someone who didn't actually exist. That insight stayed with me after they left, as I stared at the ceiling of Cassandra's guest room where I'd been staying since my apartment had been compromised. Had I loved James Caldwell, or merely the carefully constructed version of himself he'd presented? Had there been genuine moments within the strategic performance, or had everything been calculated to secure my position as his suitable partner? The questions were still circling when my phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. Ms. Morgan, Richard Caldwell requests a private meeting tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., at his office. Matters of mutual interest to discuss. Gregory Phillips. So Richard was making his move, attempting to circumvent the trustee meeting. Predictable, but telling about their level of concern. I typed a careful response. Please inform Mr. Caldwell I'll be there at 9:15. The 15-minute delay was a small power play, but in negotiations, even minor details set the tone. Morning arrived with charcoal skies threatening snow, appropriate weather for the showdown ahead. I dressed with deliberate care in a navy suit that projected authority without aggression, my grandmother's pearl earrings my only concession to sentiment. You're sure about meeting Richard alone? Cassandra asked over quick coffee. He's formidable in his own territory. Which is precisely why I need to face him there, I replied. This isn't just about the trust provisions. It's about establishing that I won't be intimidated. The Caldwell Group headquarters occupied a gleaming tower in the financial district. Its lobby a showcase of understated wealth with its marble floors and museum-quality art. The security guard recognized me immediately. I'd attended numerous functions here as James's fiancé, but now checked my ID with careful neutrality before directing me to the executive elevator. Richard's executive assistant greeted me with practiced politeness. "Mr. Caldwell is ready for you, Ms. Morgan." Richard Caldwell's corner office offered panoramic views of the city he considered his domain. He stood as I entered, gesturing to the seating area away from his imposing desk, a calculated move to create a more informal atmosphere. "Olivia," he began, the use of my first name a deliberate familiarity. "Thank you for coming." "Mr. Caldwell," I replied with matching formality, establishing boundaries immediately. "You requested this meeting." His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Please, after all this time, Richard is fine." I took a seat without responding to this overture, placing my briefcase deliberately on the coffee table between us. Richard sat across from me, his expression shifting to the benevolent patriarch persona he often adopted in difficult negotiations. "This situation has become unnecessarily complicated," he began. "James handled things poorly, and you've been hurt. That's understandable." I remained silent, allowing him to reveal his approach. "However," he continued, "there are larger considerations at play: family legacies, financial responsibilities, matters that transcend personal relationships." "The $40 million inheritance," I supplied. He inclined his head, acknowledging the direct approach. "Theodore's trust, yes. A significant family asset with complex stipulations, including the requirement that James be married to a suitable partner by his 35th birthday to access the funds," I added. "Precisely. Requirements that James was attempting to fulfill, albeit through questionable methods." Richard leaned forward, his expression earnest. "James made mistakes, Olivia. Serious ones. But those mistakes don't need to impact the broader family interests." "And what do you propose exactly?" He extracted a document from a folder beside him. "A mutually beneficial arrangement. $5 million in direct compensation for the emotional distress you've experienced. A public statement acknowledging the end of your engagement due to irreconcilable differences, protecting both your reputations. And a non-disclosure agreement regarding specific details of James's conduct or the trust provisions." I accepted the document, scanning its contents with professional detachment. "And in exchange?" "You withdraw from the trustee meeting this afternoon and cease all contact with Veronica Hayes." Interesting that he specifically mentioned Veronica. Someone had informed him of our alliance, likely Gregory Phillips monitoring our movements. "This is a generous offer," I acknowledged, buying time as I completed my review of the document. "More than generous," Richard agreed, clearly relieved at what he perceived as receptiveness. "Few relationship breakdowns result in multi-million-dollar settlements." I closed the document, meeting his gaze directly. "But most relationship breakdowns don't involve 3 years of calculated deception as part of an inheritance strategy." His expression hardened slightly. "We're offering a clean resolution, Olivia, a chance for everyone to move forward with dignity." At the cost of silence about James's behavior, I placed the document on the table between us. "You're not concerned about the harm he caused. You're concerned about the family reputation and the inheritance." "Those concerns are not mutually exclusive," Richard countered smoothly. "The settlement acknowledges the harm while protecting interests that, until recently, you were preparing to share as James's wife." I stood, gathering my briefcase. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Caldwell. I'll see you at the trustee meeting this afternoon." Alarm flashed across his face. "You're rejecting $5 million without even a counteroffer?" "I'm rejecting the premise that my silence can be purchased," I corrected. What James did wasn't simply a relationship indiscretion. It was a systematic deception designed to use me for financial gain. Those actions have consequences beyond what your settlement offers. Richard stood as well, abandoning the conciliatory approach. Be careful, Olivia. Legal battles with the Caldwell family rarely end well for the other party. Is that a threat? A reality check, he replied coldly. You're a promising young attorney. Don't damage your career by pursuing an emotional vendetta. I smiled slightly. Interesting that you frame accountability as vengeance. It reveals much about your perspective. I moved toward the door. I'll see you at 2 o'clock. His voice stopped me as I reached for the handle. He did care for you, you know, in his way. I turned back. That's the tragedy of it all, isn't it? That his way of caring was so fundamentally broken. The snow had begun falling by the time I exited the Caldwell building, delicate flakes that dissolved upon contact with the heated sidewalk. I checked my watch, 10:30 a.m. with the trustee meeting still hours away. Time to implement the next phase of our strategy. I pulled out my phone and dialed. Arthur, it's Olivia Morgan. I've just concluded a meeting with Richard. I think we should talk before the trustee gathering. 30 minutes later, I was seated in Arthur Pendleton's office at Pendleton Wright & Associates, a smaller but prestigious firm specializing in estate law. The space reflected Arthur himself, traditional, thoughtful, with subtle indications of influence in the photographs of Arthur with various politicians and business leaders. Richard offered $5 million, I informed him without preamble. Arthur's bushy eyebrows rose slightly. More generous than I expected. You declined, I assume. Of course. Good. He removed his glasses, polishing them methodically. Theodore would have appreciated your integrity. Money was never meant to be the sole arbiter of worth in his legacy. Yet that's exactly how his son and grandson have treated it, I observed. Arthur sighed heavily. To my lasting regret, yes. I've watched Richard shape James in his image for 35 years, calculating, expedient, viewing relationships as transactions. Which brings us to this afternoon's meeting. William has arrived? Last night, we had dinner together. Arthur replaced his glasses. He was disturbed by what I shared about recent events. And how do you anticipate he'll vote regarding James's qualification status? Arthur considered the question carefully. William values the Caldwell. Name and legacy above all. If presented with compelling evidence that James has acted in ways that dishonor that legacy, he might vote against his own nephew, I finished. It's possible, Arthur agreed. But Richard is formidable, and blood connections run deep. I leaned forward. What if there were an alternative approach? One that preserved the Caldwell legacy while ensuring James faces appropriate consequences for his actions. Arthur's eyes sharpened with interest. I'm listening. By the time I left Arthur's office an hour later, the snow was falling in earnest, transforming Chicago's stern architecture into something softer, more forgiving. I texted Cassandra. Meet me at La Colonnade for lunch. Bring Veronica and the final documents. The next phase of our strategy was about to begin, and timing would be everything. La Colonnade's private dining area provided the perfect combination of discretion and luxury, plush velvet drapes separating our corner from the main restaurant, soft lighting illuminating the snow falling outside the tall windows. I arrived first, securing the table furthest from curious ears and ordering sparkling water while I reviewed my notes from the meeting with Arthur. Cassandra arrived precisely at noon, Veronica following a step behind. Both looked tense but determined. Cassandra in her courtroom-ready charcoal pantsuit, Veronica more casual in a simple black dress that still conveyed understated elegance. How did it go with Richard? Cassandra asked after they were seated, not bothering with pleasantries. Exactly as expected. $5 million to go away quietly. I passed her the settlement document Richard had offered. No mention of Veronica, though he specifically requested I cease contact with you, I added, turning to Veronica. She raised an eyebrow. They're worried about us working together. With good reason, Cassandra muttered, scanning the document. With practiced efficiency. This is surprisingly generous. The confidentiality provisions are draconian, though. And you're meeting with Arthur? Veronica asked, nervously twisting the paper napkin in her lap. Productive. I lowered my voice despite our private location. He confirmed William's presence and seemed receptive to our alternative approach. The key will be presenting it as preserving the Caldwell legacy rather than punishing James. And, you think William will agree? Cassandra's skepticism was evident. Arthur believes he might, if we frame it correctly. I spread several documents on the table. Did you bring the revised proposal? Cassandra produced a sleek portfolio. Final version, with the provisions we discussed last night. Veronica has reviewed it and agrees to the terms. I turned to Veronica, who had been unusually quiet. You're certain about this? Once we present this to the trustees, there's no turning back. She met my gaze with surprising steadiness. I spent 2 years believing James's lies about our future together. Another 6 months watching him plan a wedding to you while swearing it was just a business arrangement. Her jaw tightened. Yes, I'm certain. The waiter approached, and we paused our conversation to order, a necessary break in the tension. Once he departed, I continued in measured tones. The trustee meeting is scheduled for 2 o'clock at Pendleton's offices. Arthur suggested we arrive separately. Veronica and I at 1:45, Cassandra 15 minutes later with the documentation. James and Richard will likely arrive exactly at 2, attempting to control the proceedings. And what about this? Cassandra tapped the revised proposal. When do we introduce it? Only after William votes against James, I specified. If he doesn't, we proceed with Plan B, the litigation threat. Veronica frowned. You really think he'll vote against his own nephew? I think he values the Caldwell name more than he values James personally, I replied. Arthur indicated that William was disturbed by the details of James's deception. If we can demonstrate that our alternative preserves the family legacy while ensuring the fortune isn't squandered, he might see it as the most dignified resolution. Our lunch arrived, though none of us had much appetite. We reviewed every contingency, anticipated every potential objection, and rehearsed our key points. By 1:30, we had a robust strategy and a clear sequence of events. One last thing, I said as we prepared to leave. James may attempt a last-minute intervention before the meeting. If he contacts either of you, direct him to me, but don't engage otherwise. As if summoned by my words, my phone buzzed with a text from James. Need to speak with you urgently before the trustee meeting. Can meet anywhere in the next 30 minutes. I showed it to the others. Right on schedule. Are you going to respond? Cassandra asked. No, his anxiety works to our advantage. I gathered my documents. Let's go change the course of a $40 million inheritance. The offices of Pendleton, Wright & Associates occupied a historic building in Chicago's financial district, its limestone facade dusted with snow, as Veronica and I arrived precisely at 1:45. The receptionist recognized me from earlier and directed us to a well-appointed conference room where Arthur was already waiting alongside an elderly gentleman I immediately identified as William Caldwell, James's uncle and the third trustee. Ms. Morgan, Arthur greeted me formally, rising from his seat, and Ms. Hayes, thank you for your punctuality. May I introduce William Caldwell, the third trustee of Theodore's Trust. William Caldwell had the same patrician features as his brother Richard, though tempered with a gentleness Richard lacked. His handshake was firm despite his age, his assessment of us both keenly intelligent. Miss Morgan, Miss Hayes, he acknowledged. with a slight European inflection from his years in Switzerland. A most unusual circumstance that brings us together. Indeed, I agreed. Thank you for making time for this meeting, especially given your travel from abroad. When matters of family legacy are at stake, distance becomes irrelevant, he replied cryptically, returning to his seat. Arthur gestured for us to sit at the conference table, positioned so that the remaining 2 chairs, clearly intended for Richard and James, faced the 3 of us in what I recognized as a subtle power dynamic. Ms. Frost will be joining us shortly with additional documentation, I informed Arthur, who nodded in understanding. Richard and James have confirmed their attendance, he replied. I've instructed my assistant to bring them directly in upon arrival. The tension in the room was palpable as we waited, William studying us with quiet assessment, while Arthur reviewed documents before him. Veronica looked nervous but composed, having transformed overnight from James's secret mistress to a pivotal player in his financial future. At precisely 1:55, Cassandra arrived with her briefcase, extending professional greetings to Arthur and William before taking her seat beside me. The stage was set. At 2 o'clock sharp, the conference room door opened to admit Richard and James Caldwell. Both wore nearly identical expressions of controlled displeasure that faltered momentarily at the sight of Veronica seated at the table. Richard recovered first, nodding to his brother with forced cordiality. William, unexpected to see you here in person. The circumstances seemed to warrant my presence, William replied coolly. James remained standing, his gaze fixed on me. Olivia, I tried to reach you. We need to talk privately before— Please take your seats, Arthur interrupted firmly. We have significant matters to address, and I'd prefer to proceed without delay. Richard's jaw tightened at being managed in this way, but he and James complied, taking their positions directly across from Veronica and me. As you're aware, Arthur began, this special meeting of the trustees has been called to address concerns regarding James Caldwell's qualification status under Theodore Caldwell's trust provisions, specifically in light of recent events that may bear on the moral character requirement stipulated in Section 4, Paragraph 3 of the trust instrument. Richard leaned forward. Before we proceed, I must object to the presence of Ms. Morgan and Ms. Hayes. This is a private trustee matter. Actually, Arthur interrupted smoothly, Theodore's trust explicitly permits the trustees to invite relevant parties to provide testimony when evaluating beneficiary qualifications. Ms. Morgan and Ms. Hayes are directly impacted by James's conduct and can provide essential context for our deliberations. William nodded in agreement. I specifically requested their presence, Richard. If we're to make an informed decision, we need all perspectives. Outmaneuvered before the meeting had properly begun, Richard settled back in his chair with poorly concealed frustration. Arthur adjusted his glasses. Now then, the specific question before us is whether James Caldwell continues to meet the qualification criteria established by Theodore Caldwell for distribution of trust assets upon his upcoming 35th birthday. He turned to me. Ms. Morgan, as James's former fiancée, would you share your understanding of recent events? With practiced composure, I recounted the facts with clinical precision. My 3-year relationship with James, the engagement, and the revelations at the party that exposed his parallel relationship with Veronica and his inheritance-motivated timeline. To be clear, I concluded, I have evidence, including text messages, emails, and witness testimony, confirming that James pursued our relationship specifically to satisfy the trust's suitable partner requirement, with the intention of divorcing me shortly after securing the inheritance. James shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent under what I assumed was his father's earlier coaching. Arthur turned to Veronica. Ms. Hayes, would you share your perspective on these events? Veronica spoke with surprising eloquence, describing her 2-year relationship with James, his promises that his engagement to me was just business, and his explicit statements that he would divorce me after securing his inheritance to be with her. He told me repeatedly that Olivia knew the score, that they had an arrangement, she concluded. I believed him because I wanted to, but now I understand we were both being manipulated for his financial benefit. Richard could contain himself no longer. This is absurd. James made some personal mistakes, certainly, but they hardly constitute grounds for disqualification from his rightful inheritance. Rightful? William echoed, speaking for the first time since the testimony began. An interesting choice of words, Richard. Theodore established specific conditions for James to receive these funds, conditions that reflected his concern about James's judgment and character. He turned to his nephew. James, do you deny maintaining a relationship with Ms. Hayes throughout your engagement to Ms. Morgan? James cleared his throat uncomfortably. I don't deny the relationship, but the characterization of my intentions is inaccurate. And the timing of your proposal to Ms. Morgan? Arthur inquired. 6 months before your 35th birthday deadline was coincidental? Of course not, James admitted reluctantly. I was aware of the trust requirements, but that doesn't mean my feelings for Olivia weren't genuine. I couldn't help the small, incredulous laugh that escaped me. Genuine enough to be sleeping with another woman for 2 years? Genuine enough to be planning our divorce before we even married? That's not, James began, but Richard cut him off with a warning glance. These are personal matters being deliberately framed in the worst possible light, Richard insisted. Every relationship has complications. The trust requires James to be married to a suitable partner by his 35th birthday. It doesn't dictate his personal conduct otherwise. An interesting interpretation, William remarked dryly. I knew Theodore quite well, Richard. Do you truly believe he intended his fortune to reward this kind of calculated deception? Richard's face flushed with anger. This is about James's birthright. No, William interrupted firmly. This is about Theodore's wishes and the preservation of his legacy. The trust is explicit that character considerations may disqualify an otherwise eligible beneficiary. Arthur cleared his throat. If I may, perhaps we should move to a formal determination. The question before us is whether James Caldwell's conduct, as evidenced by the testimony we've heard, violates the moral character provisions of the trust. The tension in the room was electric as Arthur continued. As senior trustee, I vote that James's actions constitute a violation of the trust's moral character requirement, disqualifying him from receiving the distribution at this time. Richard's expression hardened. As trustee and James's father, I vote that his actions, while regrettable, do not rise to the level of disqualification under the trust provisions. All eyes turned to William, whose vote would now decide James's financial future. The elderly Caldwell looked at each person in the room in turn, his expression unreadable. The elderly Caldwell looked at each person in the room in turn, his expression unreadable. After careful consideration of the testimony presented, and with deep regret, William said slowly, I must vote that James's deliberate deception of Ms. Morgan regarding their relationship, concurrent with his maintenance of a secret relationship with Ms. Hayes, constitutes conduct unbecoming the character standards Theodore established. I vote for disqualification. The blood drained from James's face. Uncle William, you can't. The vote is 2-1, Arthur announced formally. James Caldwell is disqualified from receiving the trust distribution at this time. Richard slammed his hand on the table. This is outrageous. A family betrayal orchestrated by outsiders with financial motives. The only betrayal here, William replied calmly, is James's betrayal of Theodore's expectations. Cassandra caught my eye with a subtle nod. The moment had arrived to introduce our alternative proposal. If I may, I interjected smoothly, there is another option that might better honor Theodore's intentions while addressing the current situation. Arthur raised an eyebrow in feigned surprise. Please elaborate, Ms. Morgan. I nodded to Cassandra, who distributed copies of our proposal to each person at the table. Upon reviewing the complete trust documentation, we identified an alternative distribution path that might preserve the Caldwell legacy while ensuring appropriate consequences for James's actions. Richard glanced at the document suspiciously. What alternative path? Section 7, paragraph 2 of the trust, I replied, permits the trustees to approve distribution to a spouse of the primary beneficiary, if said spouse demonstrates exceptional character and responsibility, while the primary beneficiary fails to qualify. James leafed through the document frantically. But you're not my spouse. We never married. No, I agreed, turning to Veronica. But Ms. Hayes and I have a proposal that addresses that particular issue. All eyes turned to Veronica, who sat straighter under the scrutiny. Under the plan we're proposing, she explained calmly, James and I would marry before his 35th birthday, satisfying the marriage requirement of the trust. James stared at her in disbelief. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious, Veronica replied. But there's more. I continued where she left off. As part of this arrangement, the trustees would approve Veronica as the recipient of the distribution under Section 7, paragraph 2, with the funds placed in a new trust with specific distribution parameters. Richard's eyes narrowed dangerously. And what parameters would those be? Cassandra highlighted the relevant section of our proposal. 50% of the inheritance would be allocated to charitable causes aligned with Theodore Caldwell's documented interests. 25% would be held in trust for any future children of the marriage. The remaining 25% would be accessible to James and Veronica jointly, but only with trustee approval of specific expenditures. Richard laughed incredulously. This is extortion. James would be reduced to begging for access to his own inheritance. Not extortion, William corrected, studying the proposal with growing interest. Accountability. Theodore was quite concerned about James's financial responsibility. This arrangement actually reflects his intentions rather elegantly. James turned to Veronica, desperation evident. You can't want this. To marry me under these circumstances. Actually, I do, Veronica replied with newfound confidence. For 2 years, you promised me a future while planning a different one with Olivia. You used us both. This arrangement ensures you face consequences while still preserving your family's legacy. And what do you get out of this? James demanded, turning to me. I met his gaze steadily. Justice. The satisfaction of seeing Theodore's fortune used as he intended rather than squandered, and the knowledge that your manipulation failed to achieve your goals. I turned to the trustees. The proposal includes a complete release of all legal claims Veronica and I might have against James or the Caldwell family. A clean resolution that avoids potentially damaging public litigation. Richard seemed about to explode, but Arthur spoke first. This is unorthodox, but potentially within the trustees' authority to implement. I find it rather inspired, William remarked, a hint of admiration in his voice. Theodore would appreciate the creativity while recognizing the underlying principles of accountability and legacy preservation. This is absurd, Richard sputtered. You can't seriously be considering this. This scheme. It's no more a scheme than James's 3-year deception of Ms. Morgan, William countered. And unlike his approach, this one actually honors Theodore's intentions regarding his fortune. Arthur adjusted his glasses thoughtfully. As trustees, we need to consider what best serves Theodore's wishes. He established this trust to provide for James's future while ensuring the funds would be managed responsibly. By stealing his inheritance? Richard demanded. By ensuring it's used as Theodore intended, Arthur corrected. The proposal allocates half to causes Theodore cared deeply about, preserves a quarter for future generations, and still allows James access to substantial funds, with appropriate oversight. James, who had been silently reviewing the document, finally spoke. "And if I refuse? If I don't marry Veronica? Then the trust defaults to the contingent beneficiaries specified in Section 9, Arthur explained. Various charitable foundations would receive the entire $40 million, and you would receive nothing. The ultimatum hung in the air between us." James looked trapped, calculating desperately for any escape route. "I need time to consider this," he said finally. "The trustees need time to review it properly as well," Arthur agreed. "I propose we adjourn for today and reconvene tomorrow morning." James's birthday is still 6 weeks away, giving us adequate time to finalize arrangements if we proceed with this alternative. William nodded in agreement. "A reasonable approach. We should all consider the implications carefully." Richard stood abruptly. "This meeting has been a coordinated ambush. I reserve all rights to challenge these proceedings and any resulting decisions." "Your objection is noted," Arthur replied calmly. "However, the trust grants the trustees considerable discretion in these matters. The courts typically defer to trustee judgment absent clear impropriety." The meeting adjourned with palpable tension, Richard practically dragging James from the room while shooting venomous glances at all of us. William remained seated, observing the dynamics with keen interest. Once they had departed, William turned to us with unexpected warmth. "Theodore would have appreciated your approach, Ms. Morgan. He valued clever solutions to complex problems." "You knew him well?" I asked. "He was my brother, but more importantly, my friend," William replied. "We disagreed on many things, but we shared a concern about James's development." Richard indulged the boy too much, believing wealth was a birthright rather than a responsibility. Arthur gathered his papers. "Nothing is decided yet. Richard will fight this vigorously, and James may refuse the arrangement entirely. In which case he receives nothing," Cassandra pointed out. "His pride versus $40 million? I know which I'd choose." "Never underestimate the power of wounded male ego," William remarked with surprising candor, "especially a Caldwell ego." As we prepared to leave, Arthur pulled me aside. "Richard will approach you again, likely with a higher settlement offer. Be prepared." "I expected as much," I replied. "But this was never about money for me." "I know," he said with unexpected gentleness. "That's why I believe you're offering the solution Theodore would have chosen himself." Outside, the snow had intensified, transforming Chicago into a winter wonderland that belied the emotional storm we'd just navigated. Cassandra hailed a taxi, but Veronica hesitated on the sidewalk. "Did I just agree to marry James?" she asked, a note of disbelief in her voice. "Only if he agrees to the terms," I reminded her. "And only as a legal arrangement to access the trust. The proposal includes a preset divorce after 1 year." She shook her head slowly. "2 days ago, I crashed your engagement party to confront the man who'd been lying to me for years. Now I'm potentially his fiancé while you're... What exactly?" "The architect of his comeuppance," Cassandra supplied helpfully. Despite everything, I found myself laughing, a genuine release of tension after days of strategic calculation. Life takes unexpected turns. "Speaking of unexpected," Cassandra interjected, checking her phone, "James has texted both of you requesting urgent meetings." I glanced at my own phone to confirm. James's message was predictably dramatic. "We need to talk privately. This situation can still be resolved between us without involving Veronica. Please meet me at my apartment at 7. Veronica showed me her message. "What are you thinking? This proposal is insane. Meet me at Lockwood at 7 and we'll figure out something that makes sense for us both." "Divide and conquer," I observed. Classic James. "Are you going to meet him?" Veronica asked uncertainly. "Absolutely not," I replied. "And neither should you. Any private conversation gives him opportunity to manipulate, make promises, or create divisions between us." I typed a response to James. "Any discussion should include all relevant parties. Cassandra's office, 9 a.m. tomorrow." Veronica nodded, sending a similar message. "What now?" "Now," I said. "We prepare for Richard's countermove. He won't accept defeat easily." That prediction proved accurate when, 3 hours later, Gregory Phillips called requesting an urgent, private dinner with Richard. I declined politely but firmly, reiterating that any discussions should include all parties at tomorrow's meeting. By evening, the snow had transformed into a proper Chicago blizzard, the wind howling outside Cassandra's apartment where we had gathered to review the day's developments. Veronica paced nervously by the window, watching the snow swirl in the streetlights. "What if James agrees?" she wondered aloud. "What if I actually have to marry him?" "The marriage would be purely legal," Cassandra reminded her, pouring wine for each of us. "No different than a business partnership with a predetermined dissolution date." "And if he refuses?" Veronica continued. "If he'd rather lose everything than accept these terms?" "Then he loses everything," I said simply. "And the charities Theodore valued receive $40 million. Either outcome represents justice of a sort." My phone rang, an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Ms. Morgan." The voice was unfamiliar but cultured, elderly. "This is Eleanor Caldwell, James's grandmother and Richard's mother." I straightened in surprise. "Mrs. Caldwell, this is unexpected." "I imagine so. I've remained in the background of these situations for many years." Her voice carried the weight of decades of observation. "But I understand you've created quite the predicament for my son and grandson." "I would characterize it differently," I replied carefully. "The predicament is of James's own making." "Perhaps," she acknowledged, "though I suspect your solution is rather more creative than strictly necessary for justice." "I'm merely working within the framework Theodore established," I countered. "Yes, Theodore." Her tone softened noticeably. "My late husband was indeed concerned about James's character development. Richard could never understand that concern. He believed financial success was the only meaningful measure of a man." I remained silent, waiting for her to reveal the purpose of her call. "I would like to meet with you," she said finally. "Privately, before tomorrow's trustee meeting. There are aspects to this situation you may not fully understand." Every strategic instinct warned against such a meeting without Cassandra present, yet curiosity compelled me forward. "When and where?" "My home, this evening if the weather permits. I'll send a car." She gave me an address in Chicago's Gold. "Coast neighborhood. Come alone, Ms. Morgan. This conversation should remain between us." After hanging up, I relayed the conversation to Cassandra and Veronica, both of whom immediately objected to the meeting. "It's obviously a trap," Cassandra insisted. "Richard's using his mother to get you alone for negotiation." "Or manipulation," Veronica added. "James always said his grandmother was the most formidable Caldwell of all." "Which is precisely why I need to meet her," I argued. "If she's truly the power behind the scenes, understanding her perspective could be crucial." "At least let me come with you," Cassandra pleaded. "She specifically requested I come alone," I reminded her. And I'm curious enough to comply this time. Despite their continued objections, I prepared to meet Eleanor Caldwell, the matriarch of the family that had unintentionally changed the course of my life. As the town car she'd sent navigated Chicago's snow-covered streets, I wondered what new dimension this unexpected player would add to our carefully orchestrated plans. The Caldwell matriarch's residence was a stately brownstone on one of Chicago's most prestigious blocks, its windows glowing warmly against the snowy night. A uniformed butler admitted me to an elegant foyer where portraits of Caldwell's past gazed sternly from gilded frames. "Ms. Morgan," he intoned, "Mrs. Caldwell is expecting you in the library." Following him through the tastefully appointed home, I noted the subtle displays of multi-generational wealth, not ostentatious, but unmistakable in their quality and provenance. The library he led me to was a bibliophile's dream, with floor-to-ceiling, shelves housing leather-bound volumes and a crackling fire providing both warmth and ambiance. Eleanor Caldwell rose from a wingback chair as I entered. Despite her 80-plus years, she stood straight and elegant, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her eyes sharp with intelligence that belied her age. "Ms. Morgan," she greeted me, extending a hand adorned with a single magnificent sapphire ring. "Thank you for coming, especially in this dreadful weather." "Mrs. Caldwell," I acknowledged, accepting her handshake. "I was intrigued by your invitation. Please, sit." She gestured to the chair opposite hers, close enough to the fire to be comfortable. "Would you care for tea? Or perhaps something stronger given the circumstances?" "Tea would be lovely. Thank you." She nodded to the butler, who disappeared, silently to fulfill the request. Once we were alone, Eleanor studied me with unnerving intensity. "You are not what I expected," she said finally. "And what did you expect?" "Someone more, obviously motivated by financial gain." She settled back in her chair. "Instead, I find a young woman whose actions suggest principles rather than greed." I accepted this assessment without comment, waiting for her to reveal her purpose. "I understand you've created quite an elegant solution to the trust situation," she continued, "one that preserves the Caldwell legacy while ensuring James faces consequences for his behavior." "You seem well informed," I observed. "William called me immediately after the meeting." A small smile played at her lips. "My brothers-in-law and I have maintained close communication over the years, particularly regarding family matters Richard would prefer we didn't discuss." The butler returned with a silver tea service, interrupting our conversation momentarily. Once he had departed again, Eleanor poured for us both with practiced grace. "May I speak frankly, Ms. Morgan?" "I would prefer it," I replied. "This situation with James, his deception of you, his relationship with Ms. Hayes, his focus on the inheritance, it reflects a failure of parenting that began long before you entered the picture." She sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Richard raised James to value acquisition over integrity, appearance over substance. I tried to counterbalance that influence, as did Theodore, but we were largely unsuccessful." "You don't seem surprised by James's behavior," I noted. "Disappointed but not surprised," she corrected. "Theodore established those trust conditions precisely because he recognized James's character weaknesses. The marriage requirement was never about social standing. It was Theodore's hope that a woman of substance might provide the moral compass James lacked." I couldn't help the bitter laugh that escaped me. Instead, he found someone he could manipulate for financial gain. "Yes," she acknowledged sadly, "though I suspect he underestimated you rather significantly." "Which brings us to the purpose of this meeting," I prompted. Eleanor set down her teacup with deliberate care. "I asked you here because I want to understand your true intentions. The proposal you've presented is clever, but I wonder about your motivations in suggesting Ms. Hayes marry James rather than simply allowing him to lose the inheritance entirely." It was a perceptive question that cut to the heart of the strategy Cassandra, Veronica, and I had crafted. "Two reasons," I replied honestly. "First, practical reality. If James loses the inheritance entirely, Richard would likely provide for him anyway, circumventing any meaningful consequences. Second, and more importantly, Theodore's intentions matter. His fortune should benefit causes he valued, not simply default to charities with no personal connection to him." Eleanor nodded slowly. "You've given this considerable thought." I am an attorney. Strategic thinking is part of my professional toolkit." "Indeed." She rose and moved to a desk near the window, retrieving a leather-bound portfolio. "Which is why I believe you'll appreciate this." She handed me the portfolio, which contained what appeared to be legal documents dating back several decades. "Theodore's original notes when establishing the trust," she explained, "his personal thoughts on its purpose, beyond the formal legal language." I scanned the handwritten pages with growing fascination. Theodore's concerns about James's character were explicit and prescient, but so was his hope that the trust might ultimately guide his grandson toward greater responsibility. "I've shown these to no one," Eleanor continued. "Not Richard, certainly not James. But they provide context for the provisions you've been working with." "Why share them with me?" I asked, genuinely puzzled by her openness. "Because you've demonstrated something rare in my experience with the Caldwell orbit, a commitment to principles over personal gain." She reclaimed her seat. "Your proposal aligns remarkably well with Theodore's original intentions, perhaps better than the trust instrument itself." I closed the portfolio, returning it to her. "Are you suggesting modifications to our approach?" "Not modifications," she clarified. "Enhancements. I believe there's a way to strengthen your proposal while addressing certain practicalities you may not have considered." For the next hour, Eleanor Caldwell revealed herself to be a strategic thinker whose acumen rivaled any corporate attorney I'd encountered. She identified potential weaknesses in our proposal, suggested reinforcements to prevent Richard from circumventing its provisions, and offered insights into James's likely responses to different scenarios. "Richard will attempt to challenge the trustee's authority," she predicted. "He's already consulting with litigation specialists. You should prepare for that contingency." "Cassandra has anticipated that possibility," I assured her. "The trust gives the trustees broad discretion, and courts rarely overturn trustee decisions without clear evidence of impropriety." "Richard will manufacture impropriety if necessary," Eleanor warned. "He considers this a battle for control of Theodore's legacy as much as James's inheritance." As our conversation wound down, I found myself genuinely curious about this formidable woman who had observed the Caldwell dynamics for over 60 years. "May I ask a personal question?" I ventured. "You may ask," she replied with a hint of amusement. I reserve the right not to answer. "Why didn't you intervene earlier? When you saw the path James was taking?" Eleanor's expression softened with something like regret. "A fair question. The simple answer is that I did try, in my way. The more complex truth is that families develop patterns over generations that become increasingly difficult to disrupt." She gazed at the fire. "By the time I recognized the full extent of Richard's influence on James, intervention would have required a family schism I wasn't prepared to initiate." "Until now," I observed. "Until now," she agreed. "Sometimes external forces create opportunities for change that internal dynamics cannot." As I prepared to leave, Eleanor handed me a sealed envelope. "Additional documentation that may prove useful in tomorrow's meeting, legal precedents supporting trustee discretion in similar cases." I accepted it with genuine gratitude. "Thank you for your candor and assistance." "I should be thanking you, Ms. Morgan." Her eyes held mine steadily. "You've done what I could not. Created a pathway for James to potentially become the man Theodore hoped he would be, rather than the man Richard molded." As her driver returned me to Cassandra's apartment through the still falling snow, I reflected on the unexpected alliance formed with Eleanor Caldwell. The matriarch had provided not just tactical support, but a deeper understanding of the family dynamics that had shaped James into the man who saw nothing wrong with using me as a stepping stone to financial security. The next morning would bring the final confrontation with James and Richard, a meeting that would determine not just the fate of Theodore's $40 million, but perhaps the course of the Caldwell legacy itself. With Eleanor's insights now added to our strategy, I felt newly confident in our approach. The Caldwell men had underestimated me from the beginning, first as James's suitable, manageable partner, then as a scorned fiancé they could buy off with settlement money. Tomorrow they would discover just how costly that miscalculation would prove to be. The morning of the final trustee meeting dawned crisp and clear, the previous night's snowfall transforming Chicago into a gleaming winter wonderland. I stood at Cassandra's apartment window, watching early commuters navigate the freshly plowed streets, my mind cycling through every possible scenario we might face in the hours ahead. "You barely slept," Cassandra observed, offering a cup of coffee as she joined me at the window. "Too much to consider," I admitted, accepting the steaming mug gratefully. Eleanor Caldwell added variables I hadn't anticipated. "Do you trust her?" Cassandra's tone was carefully neutral. I considered the question. Not completely, but her insights into the family dynamics ring true, and the legal precedents she provided are legitimate. Just remember who she is, a Caldwell first and foremost, which is precisely why her support matters, I pointed out. She understands the stakes in ways we cannot. Veronica emerged from the guest bedroom, dark circles under her eyes suggesting her night had been no more restful than mine. "Any word from James?" I checked my phone. 3 missed calls since 5 a.m., no messages. "Richard's been busy too," Cassandra said, turning her laptop screen to show us an email from a colleague. "He's retained Hargrove and Bennett. They specialize in trust litigation." As Eleanor predicted, I noted unsurprised. Veronica poured herself coffee with shaky hands. "Can they stop this?" "They can delay it," Cassandra admitted. "Trust litigation can drag on for years." "But they won't," I said with confidence I only partly felt. "Not once they understand the alternatives." We spent the next hour reviewing our strategy one final time. The documents were meticulously organized in Cassandra's portfolio, our presentation refined to address every potential objection. By 9:30, we were ready to depart for the meeting that would determine not just the fate of Theodore Caldwell's $40 million, but the course of several lives intertwined by deception and discovery. "Remember," I said as we gathered our things, "Richard will attempt to divide us. He'll make separate offers, appeal to individual self-interest. We stay united, regardless of what's presented." Veronica nodded firmly. "No private negotiations." "And if James refuses outright?" Cassandra asked the question we'd been circling around. "Then the contingent charitable beneficiaries receive the entire $40 million, I replied. "And James receives nothing." Pendleton's offices were hushed when we arrived. The reception area conspicuously empty except for Arthur's assistant, who greeted us with practiced professionalism. "Mr. Pendleton asked that you wait in the small conference room," she informed us. "The trustees are meeting privately before the formal session." This unexpected development set off warning bells. "All 3 trustees?" I clarified. "Yes, Ms. Morgan. They've been in session since 8 this morning." I exchanged concerned glances with Cassandra as we were led to a conference room smaller than the one we'd used yesterday. Something had changed, and we hadn't been informed. "This feels wrong," Veronica murmured once we were alone. "Agreed," Cassandra said, immediately powering up her tablet. "I'm checking for any filings Richard might have made overnight." I pulled out my phone to text Arthur, but was interrupted by a gentle knock. The door opened to reveal Eleanor Caldwell, elegant as ever in a tailored navy suit that commanded respect despite her advanced age. "Ladies," she greeted us with a subtle nod. "I see you're waiting as well." "Mrs. Caldwell," I acknowledged, surprised by her presence. "We weren't expecting you at today's meeting." "A late addition to the agenda," she explained, taking a seat across from us. "William thought my perspective might be valuable, given certain developments overnight." "What developments?" Cassandra asked sharply. Eleanor's expression revealed nothing. "I believe Arthur will explain shortly." "Ah, here he is now." Arthur Pendleton entered with William close behind him, both men looking grave. No sign of Richard or James. "Thank you all for your patience," Arthur began, adjusting his glasses. "There's been a significant development that changes our approach today." My pulse quickened. "What kind of development?" "James has made a unilateral decision," William explained, his disapproval evident. "He's withdrawing his claim to the trust distribution entirely." Stunned silence met this announcement. "He's walking away from $40 million?" Veronica finally asked, disbelief coloring her voice. "Apparently so," Arthur confirmed. His attorney filed formal notice at 8 this morning, relinquishing all rights as a beneficiary and acknowledging disqualification under the moral character provisions. This made no sense. James would never voluntarily surrender his inheritance, not after the lifetime of entitlement that had shaped him. "Where is Richard in all this?" I asked, suspicion mounting. Arthur and William exchanged glances. "That's the other development," Arthur said carefully. "Richard has resigned as trustee, effective immediately." "Something's not right," Cassandra stated flatly, vocalizing what we were all thinking. "This complete capitulation doesn't align with anything we know about either of them." Eleanor's calm voice cut through our confusion. "They haven't capitulated. They've changed tactics." All eyes turned to her. "The Caldwell Group announced a major expansion this morning," she continued. "A partnership with Wellington Industries valued at over $200 million. The deal includes naming James as Chief Operating Officer with a compensation package of approximately $5 million annually." Understanding dawned. "Richard is providing for James outside the trust," I concluded, making Theodore's inheritance irrelevant. "Precisely," Eleanor confirmed. "Richard is using the Wellington Partnership, the same deal that was crucial to James's original timeline with you, to create an alternative path for his son, one that bypasses both the trustees and your proposal." I processed this new information rapidly. So James walks away from the $40 million, but secures a position worth more in the long run. Meanwhile, the trust assets go to the contingent, charitable beneficiaries as Theodore specified. "Everyone wins?" Veronica asked uncertainly. "Not quite," William interjected. "Theodore's intention was for James to demonstrate responsibility and character growth before receiving his legacy. This arrangement circumvents that purpose entirely. But legally, we have limited recourse," Arthur admitted reluctantly. "If James formally relinquishes his beneficiary status, the trust provisions regarding alternate distribution paths become moot. Our carefully constructed strategy was crumbling before our eyes. James and Richard had found a way to technically comply with the trust while completely undermining its spirit." "There must be something we can do," Cassandra insisted, already flipping through documents. "Some provision we can leverage." I sat back, letting the implications fully register. "They've outmaneuvered us," I acknowledged quietly, "at least in terms of the trust itself." "Then they win?" Veronica's voice held both disbelief and disappointment. "Not necessarily," Eleanor said, her eyes meeting mine with unexpected intensity. "There are other considerations beyond the trust." I caught her meaning immediately. "The Wellington deal." She nodded slightly, a gesture so subtle I nearly missed it. "Cassandra," I said, mind racing, "what do we know about Wellington Industries' corporate governance?" Cassandra looked confused but pulled up information on her tablet. "Family-owned company, 3 generations, conservative management style, very image-conscious." Her eyes widened as she caught up to my thinking. "And they just announced a partnership, with a man publicly exposed for maintaining parallel relationships with 2 women as part of an inheritance scheme." "Exactly," I confirmed. "How thoroughly do you think they vetted James before agreeing to name him COO?" "Given the timeline of the announcement, not very," Cassandra replied, her legal mind engaging with the new angle. "The deal was likely Rushed through after yesterday's trustee meeting. Eleanor watched our exchange with evident approval. Wellington's board includes 3 prominent Chicago philanthropists with impeccable ethical standards. I serve with them on several charitable committees. The path forward was crystallizing rapidly. So, if the Wellington board were to receive comprehensive documentation regarding the circumstances that led to James relinquishing his inheritance claim, they might reconsider the wisdom of elevating him to a C-suite position, William finished, a glimmer of appreciation in his eyes. Arthur cleared his throat. I should note that, as trustees, we must remain neutral regarding matters outside the trust administration. Of course, I agreed smoothly. This is merely a theoretical discussion of corporate governance best practices. Theoretical, Eleanor echoed with the faintest smile. Though I believe the Wellington family would be most distressed to learn, they've been used as a convenient escape hatch from moral accountability. The door opened abruptly, admitting Richard and James Caldwell, both impeccably dressed and radiating forced confidence. Gregory Phillips, Richard's attorney, followed close behind with a portfolio tucked under his arm. I see you've been informed of James's decision, Richard announced without preamble. A difficult choice, but one that reflects mature consideration of all factors. Very mature, I agreed, my tone deliberately neutral. And impressively timed with the Wellington announcement. James at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. The Wellington partnership has been in development for months. This was always my professional trajectory. Of course, Cassandra replied smoothly, though the COO appointment seems rather accelerated. Gregory Phillips stepped forward. All business. We've prepared formal documentation for James's withdrawal as beneficiary, requiring trustee acknowledgement. He distributed papers to Arthur and William. Once executed, this matter will be concluded definitively. Richard turned to me directly. Ms. Morgan, while today's outcome differs from what you anticipated, I trust you recognize that further pursuit of this matter serves no productive purpose. The settlement offer discussed previously remains available should you wish to put this unfortunate situation behind you. His confidence was so absolute, his sense of victory so complete, that something in me hardened with renewed determination. That's very generous, I replied, gathering my documents with deliberate care. However, I believe I'll be otherwise occupied this afternoon. Suspicion flickered across Richard's face. Occupied how? Professional obligations, I said vaguely. A presentation to certain interested parties regarding corporate governance and character considerations in executive appointments. The implication landed precisely as intended. James paled visibly while Richard's expression darkened with understanding. That would be inadvisable, Richard stated, his voice dropping dangerously. Why? I asked innocently. Surely a company making a $200 million commitment deserves complete information about its new leadership. Gregory Phillips intervened smoothly. Any attempt to interfere with the Wellington partnership could constitute tortious interference with business relationships. The potential liability would be substantial. Only if the information shared is false or misleading, Cassandra countered, professional tone masking the warning beneath. Truthful disclosure of relevant facts is generally protected, particularly when matters of public interest and corporate governance are involved. An unmistakable tension filled the room as the implied threat and counter-threat hung in the air between us. Perhaps, Eleanor's measured voice broke the standoff. We should consider what Theodore would have wanted in this situation. All eyes turned to her. Richard's expression registered shock at his mother's presence. Mother, he acknowledged stiffly. I wasn't informed you would be attending. No, you wouldn't have been, she replied calmly. As you weren't informed of my dinner with Ms. Morgan last evening, or my breakfast with Harold Wellington this morning. The color drained from Richard's face. You've spoken with Harold? We serve on the Art Institute board together, Eleanor confirmed. We had a most illuminating discussion about family legacies and the character qualities essential for executive leadership. The implications of this revelation rippled through the room. Harold Wellington Sr. was the patriarch of the Wellington family, a man whose conservative values and ethical standards were legendary in Chicago business circles. "What exactly did you discuss?" James demanded, panic edging his voice. "Hypothetically," Eleanor replied with deceptive mildness, "how a family business might respond if it discovered a newly appointed executive had deliberately manipulated two women as part of a financial strategy, then attempted to evade accountability when exposed." William Caldwell made a sound suspiciously like a suppressed chuckle. Arthur maintained his professional neutrality, though I detected a glimmer of admiration in his eyes. Richard's momentary shock transformed into cold fury. "This is family. Betrayal of the highest order." "No, Richard," Eleanor corrected firmly. "Family betrayal was using Theodore's trust as a manipulation tool rather than the character development mechanism he intended. Betrayal was raising your son to value financial gain over integrity." An uncomfortable silence followed this condemnation. James looked between his father and grandmother, clearly unprepared for this family schism playing out before strangers. "What do you want?" he finally asked, addressing me directly. "Obviously, my withdrawal from the trust isn't enough." "It was never about the money, James," I replied honestly. "It was about accountability, about consequences for calculated deception." "Fine," he conceded bitterly. "What would constitute adequate accountability in your view?" I glanced at Cassandra, who gave a slight nod, then at Veronica, who straightened her shoulders in silent support. "Three things," I stated clearly. "First, a formal acknowledgement of your actions, not for public distribution, but for our records. Second, establishment of a foundation funded with $5 million from the Wellington Compensation Package, dedicated to supporting ethical business education. And third, regular participation in that foundation's mentoring program for, at least 5 years. James looked incredulous. "You want me to teach ethics?" "I want you to learn ethics," I corrected, "by actively participating in something larger than your own immediate self-interest." Richard started to object, but Eleanor raised her hand, silencing him with the authority of decades. "These are reasonable terms," she declared, "far more reasonable than Theodore might have demanded, and certainly more constructive than what might result from the Wellington Board receiving comprehensive documentation of recent events." The implied threat was clear, and judging by Eleanor's earlier revelation about her breakfast with Harold Wellington, entirely credible. "Gregory," Phillips leaned in to whisper urgently in Richard's ear, likely advising on the legal and practical implications of their options. After a tense moment, Richard gave a curt nod. "We can accommodate these terms," Phillips announced, professional mask firmly in place, "with appropriate confidentiality provisions." "Of course," I agreed. "Cassandra can work with you on the documentation this afternoon." James remained silent, his expression a complex mixture of resentment and relief. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by resignation to a fate far less punitive than he might have faced. Arthur cleared his throat. "Regarding the trust itself, if James is indeed withdrawing his claim, we should formalize the distribution to the contingent beneficiaries." "Actually," I interjected, "I have a suggestion regarding that as well." All eyes turned to me with varying degrees of wariness and curiosity. Theodore intended his fortune to benefit causes he valued while encouraging James's character development, I explained. While the first purpose can be achieved through the contingent beneficiaries, the second is lost if James simply walks away. William leaned forward, interest evident. "What are you proposing?" "A hybrid approach. Half the trust assets go to the specified contingent beneficiaries as Theodore directed. The other half establishes the foundation I mentioned, with James serving not as controller of the funds, but as a board member alongside others selected for their ethical leadership. Arthur considered this thoughtfully. The trustees would have discretion to modify the distribution in this way, particularly if it better serves Theodore's documented intentions. "This is highly irregular," Phillips objected, but without real conviction. He recognized, as we all did, that this compromise offered James a path to partial redemption, while still ensuring Theodore's fortune served its intended purpose. "I believe Theodore would approve," William stated, looking to Arthur for confirmation. Arthur nodded his agreement. "It maintains the core principles while creating opportunity for growth." "Eleanor?" "Theodore believed in redemption," she said simply, even when evidence suggested it might be undeserved. Richard recognized the shifting dynamics. With 3 trustees aligned against him, and Eleanor's connection to Wellington creating external pressure, his options were limited. "If we agree to this arrangement," he said carefully, "all claims and potential actions are resolved completely. No further demands, no future revelations." "Agreed," I confirmed, looking to Cassandra and Veronica for their assent, which both gave with slight nods. Complete resolution. James had remained unusually quiet throughout this exchange, his earlier bravado replaced by something more contemplative. And my role in this foundation would be genuine, not just window dressing? The question surprised me with its apparent sincerity. "Yes," I replied after a moment. "Meaningful participation, not performance." "I'll need to consider the specifics," he said, ignoring his father's sharp glance. "But conceptually, it has merit." Arthur checked his watch. "We've covered considerable ground this morning. I suggest we adjourn to allow legal counsel to draft the necessary documentation. We can reconvene tomorrow to formalize arrangements." As the meeting dispersed, I found myself face to face with James in the doorway. The first moment we'd been physically close since the engagement party disaster. The familiar scent of his cologne triggered an unexpected wave of emotion. Not longing, but a complex recognition of the person I'd believed I loved and the reality of who he actually was. "You could have destroyed me completely," he said quietly, searching my face. "Why didn't you?" "Because destruction wasn't the point," I replied honestly. "Accountability was, and perhaps the possibility of change." "You think I can change?" His voice held genuine curiosity rather than challenge. "I think Theodore believed you could. That's why he structured the trust as he did." I stepped past him into the hallway. "Whether you prove him right is entirely up to you." In the reception area, Eleanor Caldwell was waiting, ramrod straight despite her years, the sapphire ring on her hand catching the light as she gestured me over. "You negotiated that beautifully," she said when I joined her. Theodore would have been impressed. "I had excellent tactical support," I acknowledged. "Your revelation about Harold Wellington was masterfully timed." A hint of mischief sparkled in her eyes. I may have implied my conversation with Harold was more specific than it actually was. "We did have breakfast, but we discussed the art. Institute's upcoming benefit gala, not James's situation." She lowered her voice. "Though I certainly could have pivoted the conversation if necessary." I couldn't help but laugh at this unexpected glimpse of Eleanor Caldwell, strategic mastermind. "So you bluffed?" I implied. She corrected primly. "A subtle but important distinction, particularly when dealing with men like my son who assume women lack tactical sophistication." As we prepared to part ways, Eleanor took my hand in a gesture both formal and strangely intimate. "You would have made an exceptional Caldwell, Ms. Morgan. Far better than we deserved." "Thank you," I said, genuinely touched by the unexpected compliment. "Though I think I prefer forging my own path." "As you should." She released my hand with a final nod of approval. "I look forward to witnessing where that path leads." Outside Pendleton's offices, Cassandra, Veronica, and I stood together on the snow-dusted sidewalk. the winter sun casting long shadows as afternoon approached. "I can't believe it's actually resolved," Veronica said, wonder in her voice. "No marriage, no courtroom drama, just accountability. And a foundation that will do genuine good," Cassandra added. "More satisfying than simple revenge." I looked up at the clear blue sky, feeling the weight of the past week beginning to lift. It's not what we expected when we walked into that trustee meeting yesterday, but maybe it's something better. "What now?" Veronica asked, the question encompassing far more than our immediate plans. "Now," I said, linking arms with both of them, "we celebrate with an obscenely expensive lunch, courtesy of my firm's client development account, and then we move forward." As we walked toward Michigan Avenue's upscale restaurants, I reflected on the extraordinary sequence of events that had transformed my life in less than a week. From fiancé to strategist, from betrayed to empowered, I'd discovered capacities within myself I hadn't known existed. James had chosen me as his suitable partner, based on superficial criteria, never recognizing the depth of strategic thinking and ethical determination beneath my accommodating exterior. His grandfather, ironically, would have appreciated those qualities far more than the credentials and social standing James had prioritized. The afternoon sun glinted off the snow-covered buildings as we entered Gibson's Chicago's premier steakhouse. The maitre d' recognized me from countless client dinners with the firm and led us to a prime table with a view of the twinkling Michigan Avenue holiday decorations. "Champagne," I instructed as we settled in. "Your best bottle." "Celebrating a special occasion?" the waiter inquired as he presented the wine list. I looked at Cassandra and Veronica, these unlikely allies who had become something more through our shared ordeal. "Yes," I replied with genuine happiness. "We're celebrating new beginnings." The champagne arrived, golden bubbles dancing in crystal flutes. I raised my glass in a toast, finding words that captured not just the resolution of our immediate situation, but the transformation it had sparked. To unexpected allies, to discovering our own strength, and to futures limited only by our imagination, not by someone else's design for us. As our glasses clinked, I felt a profound sense of rightness. James had pursued me for my suitability as a temporary stepping stone to his inheritance. In doing so, he had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible, the discovery of my own capacity for strategic brilliance and ethical clarity. Theodore Caldwell had hoped his grandson would develop character worthy of his inheritance. While James's path to that development remained uncertain, I had found my own moral compass and determination through the very deception meant to use me. "What will you do now?" Veronica asked as we perused the extravagant menu. "Go back to corporate law as if nothing happened?" "Actually," I admitted, "I've been thinking about Eleanor's parting words, about forging my own path." Cassandra raised an eyebrow. "You're not leaving the firm?" "Not leaving law," I clarified, "but perhaps redirecting my focus. The foundation we're establishing will need legal counsel intimately familiar with its origins and purpose." "You want to represent the foundation?" Cassandra looked surprised. "That's unexpected." "It's more than that," I explained, the idea crystallizing as I spoke it aloud. "I'm thinking about specialized practice in ethical corporate governance, using legal structures to encourage accountability rather than avoid it. Turning your experience with James into professional expertise," Veronica observed thoughtfully. "There's a certain poetic justice to that." "Speaking of new directions," Cassandra interjected, "have you given any thought to what's next for you, Veronica, after all this settles?" Veronica twisted her napkin thoughtfully. "I've actually enrolled in business classes at the community college." Watching this whole situation unfold, seeing how contracts and legal structures shape people's choices, it sparked something. I want to understand these systems better. From cocktail waitress to business student, I noted with, Genuine admiration. James never saw your potential either. Men like James rarely see beyond their immediate needs, Cassandra observed dryly. Their loss, ultimately. Our conversation flowed effortlessly through a leisurely lunch, the tension of the past days giving way to tentative plans and shared observations. By the time dessert arrived, we had moved beyond the Caldwell drama to discussing Veronica's course schedule, Cassandra's upcoming trial, and my emerging ideas for specialized legal practice. As afternoon waned and the restaurant began preparing, for the evening crowd, we finally gathered our things to leave. Outside, the early winter darkness had descended, the streetlights illuminating gently falling snowflakes. Back to reality, Veronica sighed as we prepared to part ways. A better reality, I corrected gently. One we've shaped ourselves rather than accepted passively. Cassandra flagged a taxi, turning to us with uncharacteristic sentimentality. You know, when this all started with Veronica crashing your engagement party, I never imagined we'd end up here, with a new foundation, career changes, and unlikely friendship. Life's most important journeys rarely follow the expected path, I replied, surprising myself with the philosophical tone. Sometimes the detours lead to better destinations than the original route ever could. As I watched the taxi carrying Veronica disappear into the snowy evening, I felt a profound sense of closure mixed with anticipation. The engagement that had ended so dramatically just days ago now seemed like a fortunate escape, rather than a devastating loss. James had selected me as his suitable partner to access his inheritance, never recognizing that in doing so, he had inadvertently introduced me to a broader inheritance of my own, self-discovery, unexpected allies, and a future limited only by my own vision rather than someone else's constraints. My phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor Caldwell. Documentation proceeding smoothly. Foundation concept approved by all trustees. Your future contributions will be invaluable. I smiled at this confirmation of our success, but even more at the subtle acknowledgement of ongoing connection. Eleanor had recognized something in me that her son and grandson had missed entirely, a strategic mind and ethical core that aligned with Theodore's original intentions far better than James ever had. Tomorrow would bring meetings with attorneys, foundation structure discussions, and the beginning of my professional pivot. But tonight, walking through gently falling snow along Michigan Avenue's holiday-decorated storefronts, I savored the simple truth that had emerged from betrayal and deception. Sometimes losing what you thought you wanted creates space to discover what you truly deserve. James had pursued me because I fit his grandfather's criteria for a suitable partner in marriage. The irony was exquisite. In the end, I had proved to be Theodore's suitable partner in values and vision, while James remained the outsider to his grandfather's true legacy. As the snow continued to fall, transforming Chicago into a winter wonderland, I felt lighter than I had in years. The woman who had stood shocked and humiliated at her engagement party just days ago had discovered something far more valuable than a Caldwell marriage. She had discovered her own capacity for strategic brilliance, ethical clarity, and the courage to forge an unexpected path forward. Whatever came next, I would face it not as someone's suitable partner, but as the architect of my own future, a future now unlimited by anyone's expectations but my own. 6 months later, I stood at the podium in the elegant conference room of the newly established Caldwell Ethics Foundation, addressing its inaugural board meeting. The foundation's offices, ironically located just 2 floors below the Caldwell Group's headquarters, offered a spectacular view of Chicago's skyline. As we finalize our first grant recipients, I concluded, I want to thank everyone who helped transform a personal betrayal into something genuinely beneficial. My gaze swept across the assembled board members, Eleanor in her role as honorary chairperson, Arthur representing the original trustees, Veronica now pursuing her business degree while serving as community outreach coordinator, and yes, James. fulfilling his obligation with surprising dedication. The transformation in James over these months had been unexpected. Initially resentful of his required participation, he had gradually engaged with the Foundation's mission, his natural strategic abilities finding productive application in ethical business education rather than personal manipulation. After the meeting adjourned, James approached me as I gathered my materials. "The youth mentorship program was your idea, wasn't it?" he asked, nodding toward the presentation slides still displayed on the screen. "The concept, yes," I acknowledged. "The implementation has been largely Veronica's work." He nodded thoughtfully. "It's good. Better than anything I would have created with the inheritance if I'd received it as originally planned." The simple admission, perhaps the first completely honest statement he'd ever made to me, caught me off guard. "Thank you for saying that." As he turned to leave, he paused. "Grandfather would have preferred you as his heir, you know. Not his grandson's wife, his actual heir." Before I could respond, he continued toward the door where Eleanor waited, their weekly lunch appointment apparently next on his calendar. Cassandra joined me at the window as the room emptied. "Still, find it strange to work with him?" she asked, watching James's retreating figure. "Less each time," I admitted. "The Foundation creates a different dynamic than our personal history." The afternoon sun glinted off my grandmother's pearls, now a daily reminder of her wisdom rather than occasional formal wear. Her words echoed in my mind. Never underestimate a woman who knows exactly what she's worth. What had begun as the most humiliating moment of my life, a mistress crashing my engagement party, had transformed into the catalyst for discovering my true worth beyond anyone else's valuation. Sometimes the most devastating moments create openings for our most authentic paths forward. In losing a fiancé, I had gained something far more valuable: the unshakable knowledge of my own capacity to transform betrayal into purpose, manipulation into mission, and endings into more meaningful beginnings. Up next, you've got 2 more. Standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.